My name is Audrey Gerson. I am 28 years old, and I audit medical compliance for a living. This morning, my mother called my office to say she had just sold my grandmother's house to pay for her memory care. She told me my grandmother, who currently forgets her own last name, had agreed to the sale last year. I stayed quiet on the phone. But when my grandmother finally had a clear day, she asked for her lawyer and pointed to her nightstand. Then a notary she had hired in secret stepped forward, and my mother's smile vanished. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where family secrets are dragged into the light and quiet women stop paying for everyone else's peace. If you have ever had to protect someone who could no longer protect themselves, tell me your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. The numbers on a compliance report do not lie. They do not panic, they do not ask for favors, and they certainly do not misremember the past. As a medical and health services manager for one of the largest outpatient clinics in Grand Rapids, my entire professional life depends on that cold, predictable friction between what people claim happened and what the paper trail proves. I spend my days tracking down fraudulent Medicare billing codes, untangling insurance denials, and holding doctors accountable to the strict laws of this state. Michigan has exceptionally rigid statutes regarding vulnerable adults and healthcare compliance. I know these laws the way other people know the lyrics to their favorite songs. I was halfway through a quarterly audit when my cell phone buzzed on my desk. The screen read Brenda, my mother. I set my pen down. I answered the call and kept my eyes on the spreadsheet in front of me. Audrey, sweetie, I just wanted you to hear it from me before Diane blabs. Her voice carried that bright, forced rhythm she uses when she is trying to steer a conversation downhill. The Traverse City Place. We closed this morning. The funds just cleared. Funds. The air in my office seemed to stop circulating. The cottage on Grand Traverse Bay had been in our family since the early 80s. It was wood smoke and cedar, the anchor of every summer, and the only piece of real estate my grandmother Helen cared about. Our family is deeply rooted in the Great Lakes heritage. That cottage was not just a vacation home. It was the gathering place for 3 generations. Helen had moved into a memory care unit 3 months ago for what was supposed to be a temporary stabilization period after her vascular dementia progressed. She left her winter coats in the hall closet. She left her favorite coffee mug in the sink. Closed, I asked. I kept my voice in the same register I used to deny an insurance claim. Mom, there was no listing. You cannot sell her house. She intends to go back. Oh, Audrey, be realistic. Brenda sighed, the sound sharp and practiced. Memory care is draining us dry. It is an ocean of bills. We had to liquidate. Helen agreed to it last year anyway before things got cloudy. It is a blessing, really. She really loved that old cedar chest in the hallway. I told the buyers they could just keep it. I stopped breathing for a second. My eyes traced the grain of my desk. Loved. Past tense. My grandmother was sitting in a facility 30 miles away, eating pudding cups and watching daytime television, and my mother had just administratively buried her in the past tense. My grandmother was not dead. She was just inconvenient. Then the clinic manager in me woke up. The math formed in my head stark and unyielding. Helen was in a Tier 2 memory unit at a facility I knew well. I knew their billing structure because I had reviewed their contracts. The cost was exactly $6,400 a month. Helen earned a retired teacher pension that covered $4,000 of that. Her Social Security benefits covered another $1,800. The $600 gap was effortlessly managed by a liquid savings account. Helen had spent 40 years padding. The cottage had been paid off since 1994. There was no financial emergency. There was no ocean of bills. My mother was inventing a crisis to justify a liquidation. Who bought it? I asked. I kept my tone flat, stripping out the panic that wanted to rise in my throat. Just a nice couple, Brenda said quickly. A little too quickly. Looking for a project. I have to run, sweetie. Your sister is treating me to lunch to celebrate the weight off my shoulders. We will do dinner Sunday. The line went dead. I did not throw my phone. I did not cry. I opened a new tab on my browser. I went to the Grand Traverse County Register of Deeds public portal. I typed in Helen's parcel number from memory. The system lagged for 3 seconds before rendering the day's fresh filings. There it was. A warranty deed recorded at 9:14 this morning. Grantor: Helen Gerson by Brenda Gerson, power of attorney. Grantee: Blue Water Holdings LLC. Not a nice couple. An LLC. My fingers moved to the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs database. I searched the business name. It had been formed exactly 14 days ago. I pulled the articles of organization scanning past the registered agent located in a strip mall in Lansing, moving straight to the signature of the authorized member at the bottom of the page. The name printed on the bottom line was Greg Vance. Greg was my mother's new boyfriend, a man who flipped distressed properties for a living. I had been hanging around family dinners for 6 months offering unsolicited advice on real estate and drinking my father's old scotch. My mother had not just sold my grandmother's house. She had sold it to her own bedmate. And according to the county transfer tax stamp listed on the deed, she had sold a $500,000 lakeside property for $200,000. The theft was not even clever. It was brazen. She had used a medical crisis as a smokescreen for real estate fraud, assuming her daughters would simply nod and accept the narrative she handed down. I closed my laptop. The silence in my office rang in my ears. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray Michigan sky. A power of attorney is designed to protect a vulnerable adult. It is a sacred trust. My mother had weaponized that trust to strip her own mother of her legacy. She thought she was dealing with a compliant daughter who would rather keep the peace than ask hard questions. She forgot she raised an auditor. The paper trail had just been created, and I knew exactly how to follow it. The drive from Grand Rapids to the lakeside suburb where my grandmother lived took exactly 42 minutes. I spent every mile of it cataloging the silence inside my car. My mother had banked on my silence today. Our family always did. We were raised in the polite, conflict-averse culture of the Midwest, where keeping the peace was prized far above telling the truth. But managing medical compliance trains you out of that habit very quickly. Compliance teaches you that silence is just liability waiting to hatch. The memory care facility sat on a manicured lot near Spring Lake. It looked like a high-end lodge from the outside, featuring dark cedar siding and carefully landscaped native grass. Inside it was a locked ward. I pressed the buzzer, smiled at the receptionist, and walked through the heavy double doors into the secured wing. My professional training makes it impossible for me to visit a healthcare setting as just a granddaughter. I see the invisible architecture. I note the staffing ratios written on the dry erase board behind the nurse's station. I evaluate the cleanliness of the medication carts parked in the hallway. I register the exact brand of enzymatic cleaner they use to mop the floors, a sharp citrus scent meant to mask the inevitable odors of human decline. The staff here was competent, but they were stretched thin, running from room to room with harried expressions. I found Helen in the common area at the end of the hall. She sat in a floral recliner facing a television that was playing a baking show on mute. My grandmother, who once navigated a 30-foot sailboat across Lake Michigan in a sudden summer squall, was now struggling to unwrap a plastic cup of graham crackers. Vascular dementia is a cruel thief. It does not take a person all at once. It takes them in pieces, leaving just enough of the original structure intact to make the missing parts hurt worse. I pulled a vinyl chair up next to her and gently took the plastic cup from her hands. I peeled back the foil lid and handed it back to her. She looked at me. Her eyes, pale blue and rimmed with age, searched my face for a familiar anchor. She smiled, but it was the polite, uncertain smile you give a helpful stranger in a grocery store aisle. Before I could introduce myself, the heavy wooden doors at the end of the hall swung open. Brenda arrived. My mother did not merely enter rooms. She staged a production in them. She carried a cardboard tray of expensive coffee shop lattes, distributing them to the nursing staff with exhausted, brave smiles. She sighed heavily while touching the arm of a passing aide, playing the role of the devoted daughter carrying an unbearable burden. She was dressed in a tailored wool coat and fresh leather boots, the uniform of a woman who was managing a tragedy very well. I watched her perform from my seat in the corner. Brenda finally spotted us and glided over her heels, clicking a sharp rhythm against the linoleum. "Audrey," she said, sounding mildly surprised. "I did not know you were coming up today. You usually work late on Thursdays." I wanted to see her, I said. My voice remained level. I did not mention the phone call from that morning. I did not mention the county property portal or the limited liability company belonging to her boyfriend. The first rule of a compliance audit is that you never show the target what evidence you hold until they have locked themselves into a story. Brenda sighed again, leaning over to kiss the top of Helen's head. Helen flinched slightly, her gaze returning to the muted television screen. It is so hard seeing her like this, Brenda murmured, pitching her voice loud enough for a nearby nurse to hear. The cognitive decline is just heartbreaking. She barely knows where she is half the time. I watched my mother open her designer purse. She reached inside and pulled out a cheap, bright pink plastic hairbrush. The kind you buy at a pharmacy discount bin for $2. She opened the small drawer on the table next to Helen's recliner and took out Helen's actual hairbrush. It was a heavy, sterling silver piece monogrammed with her initials, a gift from my grandfather on their 10th wedding anniversary. Helen had used it every day of my life. Brenda slipped the silver brush into her purse and placed the pink plastic one in the drawer. "What are you doing?" I asked. Brenda waved a hand dismissively, not meeting my eyes. "Things go missing in these places, sweetie. Other residents wander into the rooms and pick things up. I am just taking the good silver home for safekeeping. We do not want her losing her valuables." It was a tiny, tactile theft of dignity. My grandmother was sitting 2 feet away, and my mother was stripping her of her history piece by piece under the guise of protecting her. I stared at the pink plastic handle sticking out of the drawer. It looked garish and insulting. "Well," Brenda said, checking her watch, "I just came to drop off her dry cleaning. I have a contractor meeting back at the house. Greg is helping me pick out new tile for the guest bathroom." Of course he is, I thought. He just bought a lakeside cottage for less than half its market value. He can afford nice tile. After Brenda left, the air in the room felt thinner. I sat with Helen for another 20 minutes until a recreation aide came to take her to a music therapy session. Once Helen was safely wheeled down the hall, I walked over to the main nurse's station. The charge nurse, a tired-looking woman whose badge read Sarah, was updating patient charts on a dual-monitor computer setup. I leaned against the high counter. In my role as a clinic manager, I interact with charge nurses daily. We speak the exact same language of liability, privacy laws, and documentation. "Hi, Sarah," I said. "I am Audrey Helen Gerson's granddaughter. I am a health services manager over at the Grand Rapids Clinic. I just wanted to verify a few things regarding my grandmother's care plan." Sarah nodded her shoulders, relaxing slightly at the professional kinship. "Sure thing, Audrey. What do you need?" "I know my mother is the primary medical power of attorney," I said smoothly. But she mentioned some preliminary financial paperwork she had Helen sign about 3 months ago, right around admission. I just need to cross-reference the capacity evaluations from that week for a secondary insurance audit. Could we glance at the neurologist's intake notes? Because I carried myself with administrative authority, and because I was a documented family member asking a seemingly routine procedural question. Sarah did not hesitate. She clicked through the electronic medical record system, navigating to the physician notes from 12 weeks prior. "Let us see," Sarah murmured, scrolling down the screen. "Intake week. Dr. Aris did the neuro evaluation on Tuesday the 14th. I leaned in just enough to read the screen. The date Brenda had claimed Helen signed the preliminary agreement to sell the cottage fell exactly in that second week of admission. My mother had casually stated on the phone that Helen agreed to the sale before things got cloudy. The clinical notes on the glowing monitor told a starkly different story. "Patient exhibits profound short-term memory deficits," the neurologist had typed. "Patient unable to recall current year location or name of deceased spouse. Patient unable to state her own last name upon repeated prompting. Scored 11 out of 30 on the mini mental state examination. Patient lacks capacity to make complex medical or financial decisions. Recommend immediate activation of designated power of attorney." I stared at the blue text. The words formed a legal and medical ironclad wall. On the exact week my mother claimed my grandmother willingly agreed to liquidate her beloved family cottage. My grandmother could not remember her own last name. The attending physician had formally declared her legally incapacitated. A power of attorney cannot execute a sale of real estate, claiming the principal directed it if the principal lacks the cognitive capacity to direct anything. and a fiduciary cannot sell an asset at a severe discount to a romantic partner. The law calls that self-dealing. The probate courts call it theft. "You okay, Audrey?" Sarah asked, glancing up from the monitor. "I am fine," I said, forcing my jaw to unclench. "Thank you, Sarah. That clears up the timeline perfectly." I walked out of the facility and into the cold Michigan afternoon. The wind coming off the lake was biting, but I barely felt it. My mother had not just bent the rules of family etiquette. She had not just made a tough financial call under pressure. She had taken advantage of a woman trapped in the fog of a decaying brain. She had executed legal documents under false pretenses. She had committed blatant documentable elder fraud. The paper trail was rigid, undeniable, and currently sitting in a secure server waiting to be pulled into the light. I got into my car and gripped the steering wheel. Brenda thought she had neatly tied off the loose ends of my grandmother's life. She thought she could buy my silence with a fancy dinner and a practiced smile. She was about to find out that when you steal from a woman who raised an auditor, you do not just face a polite family disagreement. You face a reckoning. I started the engine and shifted the car into gear. I knew exactly where I was going next, and I knew the exact price my mother was about to try and put on my conscience. Sunday dinner at my mother's house was historically a predictable affair. It usually involved a roast boiled potatoes and endless complaints about local property taxes or the rising cost of utilities. We are a standard practical Midwestern family, built on coupon clipping and quiet endurance. But tonight, the dining room looked like a staging ground for a wealthy lifestyle magazine. The front walkway was lined with fresh, expensive landscaping. Inside, a catered spread of roasted duck truffle potatoes and imported asparagus sat on the good china. Brenda poured a dark Cabernet that cost more than my first vehicle. She wore a pristine silk blouse that still held the faint, crisp crease of a high-end department store display. My older sister Diane sat across from me, gripping her crystal wine glass like a life preserver in a storm. Diane is 5 years older and runs a bespoke clothing boutique in downtown Grand Rapids. Her store has been suffocating slowly for 3 years. I know her financial vitals because I accidentally saw a bright red past due notice from a commercial lender on her kitchen counter last Thanksgiving. Her retail space is a sinking ship of unsold inventory, changing fashion trends, and maxed out credit lines. Diane wears the stress like a tight collar. Tonight she looked frayed around the edges, her smile brittle, her eyes darting between the expensive food and our mother's glowing, triumphant face. The atmosphere in the room felt thick and highly curated. Brenda steered the conversation away from anything real or challenging, focusing instead on her boyfriend Greg and his brilliant vision for the Traverse City property. He was apparently planning to gut the historic cedar interior, tear out the stone fireplace my grandfather built by hand, and replace it all with cheap gray laminate flooring to maximize resale value. I cut my roasted duck into precise identical squares, chewing quietly while my mother narrated the systematic destruction of my childhood sanctuary. Diane nodded along, enthusiastically agreeing with every word. My sister was functioning on fumes, desperate for a financial lifeline, willing to validate any story that ended with her own survival. Our family operates on an unspoken, deeply ingrained code. You keep the peace, you guard the family image from outsiders, and you never audit the matriarch. I watched them perform this ritual of denial, feeling the cold weight of the medical chart notes still burned into my memory. My mother had stolen a house from a woman who could not remember her own last name, and now she was serving gourmet poultry to celebrate the heist. When the dinner plates were cleared, Brenda smiled. It was a wide, benevolent expression that did not reach her eyes. She reached into her designer leather handbag and placed 2 envelopes on the polished mahogany table. She slid one toward Diane and one toward me. "I have been thinking a lot about legacy," Brenda said, folding her hands neatly over her empty plate. "Your grandmother always wanted to see her girls taken care of. Now that the cottage is sold and the memory care bills are permanently managed, I realize there is enough left over to do something special for my daughters. Call it an early inheritance." I looked down at the envelope resting near my water glass. It was thick, heavy cream stationery with a delicate, deckled edge. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized that specific paper instantly. My grandmother Helen used to hoard this exact brand in the top drawer of her roll-top desk at the lake. She saved it for special occasions, treating each heavy sheet like a rare commodity, using it only to write important letters or milestone birthday cards. Brenda had not just emptied Helen's bank accounts and fraudulently transferred her real estate. She had physically raided her desk, stealing the very paper Helen used to communicate her love, and was now using it to package a bribe. It was a microscopic cruelty, a tiny pebble of disrespect that somehow felt heavier and more violating than the property sale itself. "There is $20,000 in each envelope," Brenda announced, her voice dripping with artificial practiced grace. "A cashier's check. Clean and clear. I want you both to use it for something meaningful. Pay off some lingering debt. Take a deep breath. Enjoy your lives." Diane let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She tore into her envelope with shaking, frantic fingers. When she saw the printed check, tears spilled over her mascara, staining her cheeks. She stood up abruptly, knocking her heavy wooden chair back against the wall, and threw her arms around our mother. Diane wept into Brenda's silk shoulder, thanking her profusely, calling her an angel, saying this money would finally save the boutique from impending foreclosure. She acted as if Brenda had manifested the wealth out of thin air through sheer maternal goodness. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I looked at the heavy cream paper sitting in front of me. I did not touch it. I understood exactly what this money represented. It was not a gift. It was not a motherly blessing. It was a severance package for my conscience. Families in this state pride themselves on fierce, unquestioning loyalty. We close ranks when trouble comes. We handle our business behind drawn blinds and locked doors. Brenda was weaponizing that specific culture, banking on the assumption that $20,000 would buy my permanent complicity. By accepting the check, I would become a co-conspirator in the fraudulent liquidation of my grandmother's estate. The money was a contract intended to legally and morally bind me to the false narrative that Helen had willingly authorized the sale. If I took the cash, I could never report the crime without implicating myself. I would be bought and paid for. Brenda patted Diane's back, soothing her, playing the savior role perfectly. Then her gaze shifted to me. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she noticed my envelope remained untouched on the mahogany wood. "Open it." "Audrey," she urged, her tone shifting from warm generosity to instructive command. "You work so many exhausting hours at that clinic. You could upgrade your car. Take a real vacation. Put it toward a down payment on a house of your own." I reached out and placed my index finger on the cream paper. I felt the textured surface, imagining my grandmother's arthritic hands carefully storing it away in the dark cedar drawer. I applied light pressure to the envelope and slid it back across the table. It stopped precisely in front of Brenda's wineglass. "I can't accept this," I said. My voice was the flat, measured tone I used to inform a physician they have violated a strict compliance protocol. The room went dead silent. Diane stopped crying and stared at me, wiping a dark streak of makeup from her cheek, her face twisting in genuine confusion. "Don't be ridiculous," Brenda said, letting out a short, hollow laugh that echoed off the dining room walls. "It is your inheritance. Helen would want you to have it. Helen lacks the cognitive capacity to want anything," I stated, locking my eyes onto my mother's face and refusing to blink. "The neurologist charted her examination score at 11 during the exact same week you claim she authorized this transaction. She could not recall her own name. She certainly did not authorize you to sell our family home to Greg for less than half its market value." Diane gasped, clutching her check to her chest like a protective shield. She looked at Brenda, waiting for a denial, an explanation, anything to justify the financial lifeline she had just cashed in her soul to receive. Brenda did not deny a single word. Her warm, benevolent facade evaporated entirely, leaving behind a cold, sharp architecture of pure self-preservation. The mother who had just served catered duck disappeared. The woman sitting across from me was a cornered predator calculating her next defensive maneuver. "You always have to ruin everything with your rigid paperwork," Brenda sneered, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "I am the medical and financial power of attorney. I make the difficult decisions. I carry the brutal burden of her daily care while you sit in your sterile little office judging me. You are a fiduciary," I corrected her, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "And you engaged in felony self-dealing." Brenda leaned forward, planting her palms flat on the edge of the dining table. The expensive Cabernet trembled in its crystal glass. Her eyes were dark, entirely devoid of any maternal warmth or hesitation. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as a liability that desperately needed to be neutralized. "I am offering you a generous gift," Brenda said, each word coated in frost. "Take the envelope. Go back to your apartment. Be grateful for what you have. Don't make me cut you out of this family, Audrey." I walked away from the dining room table without saying another word. The heavy oak front door shut firmly behind me, sealing the warmth, the expensive roasted duck, and the insidious lies inside that house. The autumn air in Grand Rapids carried the sharp, damp chill that bit through my thin cardigan, a sudden physical shock after the suffocating atmosphere of the dinner. I focused on the rhythmic sound of my own footsteps against the concrete walkway, measuring my breathing. In my profession, you learn how to compartmentalize adrenaline very quickly. When a clinical provider attempts to forge a patient chart, you do not panic or throw a tantrum. You secure the evidence, you maintain a neutral expression, and you leave the room. I was operating on that same cold professional instinct now. I reached my car and reached into my pocket to unlock the doors. Before my hand could even pull the handle, the sound of rapid, frantic footsteps echoed across the driveway gravel. "Audrey, wait!" I turned around to see Diane hurrying toward me. My older sister clutched her designer sweater tightly around her shoulders to ward off the cold. Her face looked pale and exhausted under the harsh, flickering glow of the street lamp. She still held the heavy cream envelope in her right hand, gripping it so fiercely that the pristine, deckled edges crumpled under her fingers. "What are you doing?" Diane asked. Her voice trembled, teetering dangerously between panic and unrestrained anger. "Why do you always have to act like this? Why must you always ruin every single good thing for us?" "Act like what, Diane?" I replied, keeping my posture relaxed but guarded, observing her the way I would observe a hostile witness during an internal audit. "You mean act like someone who recognizes blatant financial fraud when it is served on a silver platter alongside the imported asparagus. You are rocking the boat for no reason," she hissed, stepping closer, her breath pluming in the cold air. "Mom is just trying to fix things. She is managing an impossible burden with Helen. Do you have any earthly idea how much stress she carries every single day?" "I know exactly how much she carries," I said evenly. "And I know she sold the Traverse City property to Greg. She used his newly formed limited liability company to purchase our family heritage at a steep discount. You knew about this, did you not? You sat there eating dinner knowing Greg was the buyer." Diane did not feign ignorance. She looked down at the dark asphalt, her silence confirming my suspicion. She had known all along. "It is just a business deal," Diane muttered, offering a weak, rehearsed defense. "Greg has the capital to renovate the cottage. Mom needed the cash flow to secure Helen's long-term care without draining her own retirement. The minor details do not matter if the ultimate outcome protects the family. The details are the only thing that matter in a court of law," I countered. I studied my sister closely. Diane had always been the golden child, the one who married young and opened a boutique projecting an image of effortless, curated success. But her retail business was suffocating under a mountain of commercial debt. She was drowning, and she had decided our grandmother was a permissible casualty for her own rescue. Tears welled in Diane's eyes, genuine and desperate. She wielded her weeping like a weapon, a tactic she had perfected since childhood. "You do not understand what it is like," Diane sobbed, gesturing wildly with the hand holding the stolen money. "You sit in your quiet apartment with your stable, predictable paycheck. You do not have children depending on you. The twins need their private school tuition paid by next Friday. If they get pulled out mid-semester, it will destroy their social lives and their academics. The boutique is failing, Audrey. The bank is threatening to seize my house. I am losing everything I have built." She stepped forward, trying to grab my arm, but I stepped backward, maintaining my physical boundary. "So you steal from a woman with vascular dementia?" I asked, my tone dropping to a clinical chill. "You let Mom strip her of her primary asset so you can keep up appearances at a prep school. You are funding your lifestyle with stolen property, Diane. That is the reality." "It is an early inheritance," Diane pleaded, raising her voice, desperate to legitimize the crime. "Helen would want the boys to stay in their school. She loves her great-grandsons. She would gladly give us this money if she could. But she cannot give it." I stated, drawing a firm verbal line that cut through her emotional manipulation. She lacks the cognitive ability to make that choice. You are stealing from a ghost. Diane's desperation morphed into a defensive sneer. The tears dried up instantly, replaced by a hardened, cynical edge. The vulnerable mother vanished, leaving behind an accomplice. You think you are so morally superior, Diane snapped. You think you can just march in here, quote some statutes, and invalidate the sale. But you cannot do a thing. The paperwork is ironclad. We made sure of it. That sentence triggered a loud alarm in my mind. We made sure of it. What do you mean by we, Diane? I asked, watching her face intently, catching the exact moment she realized she had spoken too freely. Diane tried to backtrack, but the arrogance of her desperation propelled her forward. Mom needed a witness. She spat, her words rushing out in a defensive torrent. The title company required 2 signatures to verify the power of attorney document was executed while Helen still possessed legal capacity. Mom brought the blank forms to my house last month. We dated them back to November. We secured the timeline so nobody could question the transfer. The chill in the autumn air suddenly felt suffocating. The scope of the betrayal expanded rapidly, swallowing the entire driveway and my entire understanding of my family. My sister was not merely a passive beneficiary of this real estate crime. She was an active, willing co-conspirator. Diane had knowingly committed perjury and document forgery to help Brenda secure the legal authority needed to liquidate the estate. They had colluded to alter legal timelines, effectively erasing the neurologist's devastating evaluation from the official property record. They conspired to bypass the strict Michigan probate regulations designed specifically to prevent this exact type of elder exploitation. My family was not just dysfunctional. It was a functioning criminal enterprise. I looked at my older sister. The woman who used to braid my hair before elementary school was now an eager participant in a felony. She stood shivering in the driveway, clutching $20,000 of dirty money, waiting for me to yield to the pressure. You forged the witness dates, I said, stating the fact without a single trace of inflection. I protected my children, Diane retorted, lifting her chin in defiance. And you will keep your mouth shut if you care about this family at all. Mom will destroy you if you try to intervene. She has the lawyers. She has the documents. You have nothing but a bad attitude and a superiority complex. I have the truth, I said quietly. The truth does not pay the mortgage, Audrey. I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat. I did not offer a counter-argument. You do not negotiate with a compromised entity. You document the breach, you gather your resources, and you escalate the response. Goodbye, Diane, I said. I shut the door, cutting off whatever desperate excuse she planned to hurl next. I started the engine. The headlights illuminated her standing on the gravel, a frail, compromised woman gripping a cream envelope that tied her to a crime. I shifted into reverse and backed out into the dark street. As I drove away from the house, the gravity of the situation settled over me like a heavy lead apron. There was no internal ally waiting to assist me. There was no moral compass left in my childhood home. I was entirely alone. My mother had orchestrated the theft. My sister had forged the compliance barriers to shield it. They had built a fortress of lies around my grandmother, assuming their combined familial weight would crush any resistance from the youngest daughter. They failed to consider one crucial variable. A health services manager knows that every forged document leaves a digital footprint. Every fraudulent transaction requires a vulnerable access point, and a backdated signature always cracks under the pressure of a legitimate timeline audit. I gripped the steering wheel, watching the suburban houses blur past my window in the darkness. I was the only person standing between my grandmother and total financial liquidation. The preliminary skirmish was over. A solitary war had just begun. I returned to my apartment just after 10 o'clock at night. The silence inside my living room offered a stark contrast to the sprawling deception I had just uncovered in my mother's driveway. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I walked straight to my kitchen island, switched on a small pendant lamp, and placed my keys on the cold granite counter. I did not feel the urge to sleep. Adrenaline is a very specific fuel. It burns clean and keeps your mind sharp, provided you know exactly where to direct it. When a healthcare facility faces a severe compliance failure, the protocol is rigid and unforgiving. You isolate the compromised department. You freeze the accessible records. You begin the meticulous, grueling process of cross-referencing every insurance claim, every physician's signature, and every digital timestamp until the exact origin of the fraud is dragged into the light. My family had just become a failing clinic. I was stepping into the role of the state auditor, and I was going to dismantle their operation piece by piece. I brewed a pot of dark coffee, carried my laptop to the kitchen island, and opened a blank spreadsheet. I created a new encrypted digital folder on my desktop. I named it Traverse City Audit. I spent the first 2 hours pulling the relevant statutes from the Michigan Estates and Protected Individuals Code. Our state legislature does not treat elder exploitation lightly. The laws are written with sharp teeth designed to punish those who prey on the vulnerable. I typed out the legal definitions, building a framework for the prosecution I was mentally assembling. A fiduciary is legally obligated to act strictly in the best interest of the principal. Brenda held a durable power of attorney, which made her a fiduciary for my grandmother. Selling a $500,000 lakeside property for $200,000 to a limited liability company owned by her own boyfriend was a textbook breach of that duty. The legal term is self-dealing. When the victim is a legally incapacitated senior citizen, the probate courts do not view self-dealing as a mere civil dispute. They view it as felony financial exploitation. My mother and sister had conspired to backdate the witness signatures on the authorization forms to bypass the title company's compliance checks. They thought their familial bond would act as an impenetrable shield against legal scrutiny. They assumed nobody would dare audit a grieving daughter managing a difficult medical crisis. I needed a physical notepad to sketch out a timeline of the forged signatures. I pulled open the top drawer of my desk in the corner of the living room, pushing aside a stack of old utility bills and stray paper clips. As I reached for a yellow legal pad, my fingers brushed against a piece of glossy paper tucked underneath. I pulled it out. It was a photograph. The image captured a bright July afternoon in Traverse City, taken nearly 15 years ago. I was 13, sitting on the edge of the weathered wooden dock behind the cottage. Helen sat next to me, her silver hair blowing across her cheek in the wind off the bay. She was in the middle of teaching me how to tie a proper cleat hitch with a heavy braided mooring line. Her hands in the photograph were strong-tanned and deeply capable. Her eyes sparkled with that sharp, unmistakable intelligence she carried into every room she entered. I stared at the photograph, tracing the outline of the cedar siding on the cottage in the background. The smell of pine needles and damp sand seemed to rise from the image, filling my quiet apartment. That cottage was the physical embodiment of my grandmother's independence. It was the place where she taught me how to read a nautical chart, how to clean a freshly caught perch, and how to stand my ground in an argument. My mother had traded that legacy to fund her boyfriend's real estate portfolio and pay for my sister's private school tuition. Brenda had replaced Helen's sterling silver hairbrush with a cheap piece of pink plastic, erasing her dignity while simultaneously draining her bank accounts. The betrayal was no longer just a violation of the probate code. It was a visceral, deeply personal theft. I placed the photograph gently next to my laptop. It would serve as my anchor for the rest of the night. I returned to the Michigan legal databases, my focus narrowing onto the specific vulnerability in Brenda's plan. The backdated signatures Diane had confessed to in the driveway were a critical piece of leverage. However, a verbal confession delivered in the dark without a recording is legally classified as hearsay. If I went to the authorities with only my word against theirs, Brenda would simply deny the conversation took place. Diane would fall in line playing the victim, claiming I was a disgruntled daughter inventing lies out of jealousy to shatter their defense. I needed documentation that transcended their forged timeline. I needed concrete proof that Brenda's power of attorney had been restricted, challenged, or formally revoked before the real estate transaction occurred. I needed evidence showing that Helen had recognized the threat and taken defensive action while she still possessed her cognitive faculties. But Helen was currently locked in a memory care unit, unable to remember her own last name. The window for her to generate new legal documents had closed months ago. I rubbed my tired eyes, watching the digital clock on my computer screen shift to 4 in the morning. The sky outside my window was beginning to take on the dull, bruised purple hue of early dawn. I had built a comprehensive map of the crimes my family committed, but I was missing the key mechanism to trigger the trap. My cell phone resting on the granite counter next to my coffee mug suddenly lit up. The screen displayed a missed call and a new voicemail notification. The caller ID registered a local northern Michigan area code, but the number itself was unsaved in my contacts. I picked up the phone, feeling a strange prickle of anticipation at the base of my neck. Nobody calls a clinic manager at 4 in the morning unless there is a crisis. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the automated system announce the message. A man's voice came through the speaker. It was gruff, hesitant, and carrying the distinctive slow cadence of a lifelong northern Michigan resident. Audrey, the voice said. It is Tom. Tom from next door up at the lake. I immediately recognized the name. Tom was a retired marine mechanic who lived in the property adjacent to Helen's cottage. He had known my grandmother for 3 decades. They used to share coffee on their respective porches every summer morning. I am sorry to call so early. Tom continued, the audio crackling slightly with static. Your mother called me yesterday afternoon. She told me the cottage sold. She said Helen wanted it that way. I just wanted to reach out and say how sorry I am to see your family leave the bay. The line went quiet for a few seconds. I could hear Tom taking a slow, heavy breath. But I have to be honest with you, Audrey, he said, his tone dropping into a cautious whisper. Something's about this sale does not sit right with me. Your grandmother loved that house more than anything. And I keep thinking about what happened right before she got sick. Right before your mother came up and moved her down to that facility. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, holding my breath. Helen was having some bad days back then, Tom said. But she still had her sharp moments. About a week before she left, she asked me to come over and fix a broken hinge on her back door. While I was working on the porch, a black car pulled into her driveway. 2 visitors got out. They were wearing formal suits carrying heavy leather briefcases. They stayed inside with Helen for over an hour. Your mother was not there. Nobody in your family was there. Another pause stretched across the recording. Helen asked me not to mention those visitors to Brenda. Tom finished, his voice tight with lingering concern. She said she was taking care of her own future. I figure you ought to know that, seeing as the house is gone now. Give me a call back if you want to talk. The voicemail ended with a soft beep. I lowered the phone and stared at the photograph resting on my kitchen island. The missing link had just presented itself. My grandmother had not surrendered to the fog without a fight. She had hosted visitors in suits. She had conducted secretive business behind my mother's back. The trap was already set, waiting patiently in the past, and I just needed to find out where Helen had buried the key. The morning sun cast long, pale shadows across the employee parking lot of the Memory Care Center. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes before turning off the engine. The voicemail from Tom, the retired marine mechanic in Traverse City, echoed in my mind on a continuous loop. Visitors in suits. A secret meeting. Taking care of her own future. My grandmother had orchestrated a legal maneuver right before her mind surrendered to the disease, and she had hidden the evidence from her own daughter. I needed to find out where she buried it. Entering a secure dementia ward requires a specific type of psychological armor. You must prepare yourself to look at a face you have loved your entire life and see a stranger looking back. As a health services manager, I train my staff to separate the patient from the pathology. You cannot let the disease break your heart every time you walk into a room, or you will never be able to provide competent care. I wrapped that clinical detachment around myself like a heavy lead shield, swiped my visitor badge at the front desk, and walked down the quiet hallway toward room 204. The scent of institutional laundry detergent and pureed peaches hung thick in the warm air. I knocked lightly on the wooden doorframe before pushing it open. Helen sat in her wheelchair near the window, her frail hands resting in her lap. The morning light illuminated the thin, translucent skin covering her knuckles. She wore a soft lavender sweater I had bought her for her last birthday, though the collar was buttoned incorrectly. "Good morning, Grandma," I said, keeping my voice gentle and bright. I pulled a plastic visitor chair close to her knees and sat down. Helen turned her head slowly. Her pale blue eyes scanned my face, searching through the tangled neural pathways of her decaying memory. Vascular dementia destroys the brain in a stair-step pattern. Patients plateau for weeks maintaining a semblance of routine and then drop to a lower level of function overnight. I watched her struggle to place my features into a recognizable context. "Hello, little bird." Helen whispered, a soft smile spreading across her fragile face. My chest tightened, a sharp physical ache blooming beneath my ribs. Little Bird was a nickname she gave me when I was 7 years old, back when I used to follow her around the cottage dock, trying to mimic the calls of the seagulls. She did not know I was a grown woman managing a medical clinic. She did not know my adult name. Her mind had retreated to a safer decade, seeking refuge in a time long before the confusion set in. I forced my clinical shield to hold the line, swallowing the grief before it could alter my expression. "It is good to see you," I replied, reaching out to gently squeeze her hand. Her fingers felt cold and delicate like dry twigs. Helen looked back out the window at the parking lot, her smile fading into a look of vague concern. "We need to check the mooring lines," she murmured, her voice drifting. "The wind is picking up off the bay. The storm always comes in fast across the water." She was looping. Dementia patients often get trapped in repetitive cognitive cycles, anchoring themselves to strong emotional memories when their present reality becomes too terrifying to process. The cottage was her strongest anchor. "The boat is secure," I promised, playing along with her reality to keep her calm. Tom from next door helped us tie it down. At the mention of her neighbor, a subtle shift occurred in Helen's posture. Her hands began to tremble. She pulled them away from my grasp and started smoothing the fabric of her blanket, her palms rubbing frantic tight circles over her knees. The repetitive motion is a classic clinical indicator of escalating anxiety. "Tom is a good man," Helen muttered, her breathing growing shallow and rapid. She continued smoothing this blanket, her eyes darting toward the small wooden closet in the corner of the room. "He fixes the hinges. He keeps the doors closed. But the folder is missing." I leaned forward, keeping my movements slow so I would not startle her. "What folder, Grandma?" "The blue folder," Helen insisted, her voice rising in distress. Her fingers clawed at the soft fabric of the blanket, pulling the threads tight. "I put the papers in the blue folder for the men with the briefcases. But I cannot find it. The drawer is empty." My heart hammered against my ribs. Tom was right. She had executed legal documents. "Where did you put the blue folder?" I asked, maintaining a calm, soothing tone despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "Did you give it to the men in the suits?" Helen did not answer. She continued, her frantic smoothing motion lost in the anxiety of the missing object. The fog of the disease was thick, wrapping her thoughts in an impenetrable haze. I needed a way to break through the confusion without triggering a severe panic response. In medical training, we learn that sharp, specific sensory cues can sometimes pierce cognitive decay. I reached out and placed both of my hands firmly over hers, stopping the frantic rubbing. I leaned in close, making direct eye contact. "Helen," I said, dropping the gentle, childlike tone and speaking with firm, grounded authority. "Look at me. Brenda sold the cottage. Brenda sold the water." The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The cloudy, wandering look vanished from Helen's pale blue eyes. Her pupils dilated. The fog tore open, revealing a startling raw clarity that made me catch my breath. For 5 seconds, my grandmother was entirely present in the room. The formidable woman who raised me was staring back, armed with the full weight of her intellect and a profound, chilling terror. "Brenda is taking the water away," Helen whispered. Her grip on my hands turned suddenly fierce, her frail fingers digging into my skin with shocking strength. Her eyes darted toward the hallway door and then locked back onto mine. "I knew she would try. She wants the land. She always wanted the land." I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my ears. "What did you do with the papers, Grandma? How do I stop her?" Helen pulled me down by the wrists until my ear was inches from her mouth. "I locked it," she hissed, her voice carrying the desperate urgency of a prisoner passing a final message through the bars. I locked the water away from her. "You have to find the blue folder." "Where did you hide the lock?" I pressed, desperate to keep the lucid window open for just one more second. "Please tell me where it is." Helen opened her mouth to answer. I watched the muscles in her throat work, trying to push the vital information past her vocal cords. But the window slammed shut. The profound clarity drained out of her eyes like water emptying from a cracked basin. Her grip on my wrists went entirely slack. The fierce, intelligent woman retreated, swallowed whole by the decaying architecture of her brain. Helen blinked slowly, her posture slumping back against the floral fabric of the wheelchair. She looked down at her hands as if she did not know who they belonged to. "I am feeling quite parched, little bird," Helen said, her voice returning to the soft, wandering tone from earlier. "Do you think we might have a cup of chamomile tea before the storm hits?" The heartbreak hit me with the force of a physical blow. The crucial information was gone, buried back under the unyielding weight of the disease. I took a deep, shaky breath, fighting the urge to shake her, fighting the desperate, selfish desire to drag my grandmother back into the harsh light of reality. My clinical armor cracked, but I forced the pieces back together. I could not break down in this room. "I will go get you some tea right now," I said, keeping my voice steady. I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles out of my own skirt, taking a moment to compose my expression. I needed to leave the room, locate a nurse, and find a place to process the revelation. My grandmother had engineered a legal lock to protect the Traverse City property, and she had hidden the documentation inside a blue folder. The real estate sale my mother just executed was almost certainly fraudulent on a much deeper level than I originally anticipated. I turned toward the doorway, ready to step out into the corridor. Brenda was standing perfectly still in the center of the doorframe. She wore a crisp beige trench coat and carried a fresh floral arrangement in a glass vase. Her posture was rigid, her shoulders squared, and her eyes were fixed on my face with a cold, terrifying intensity. She had been standing there long enough to witness the end of the exchange, long enough to see me leaning over the wheelchair, long enough to know I was interrogating her incapacitated mother. The air in the small room turned to ice. We stared at each other over the top of Helen's head. The polite Midwestern family illusion burned away completely in that silence. Brenda did not offer a bright morning greeting. She did not ask how Helen was doing. She set the heavy glass vase down on the nearest dresser with a dull, resonant thud. "I told you not to agitate her," Brenda said. Her voice was flat, carrying the quiet, deadly cadence of a warning shot fired across the bow. I met her gaze, refusing to step back, refusing to lower my eyes. The solitary war had moved into the open, and there was no retreating now. I left the room that morning without exchanging another syllable with my mother. In a high-stakes standoff, the first person to speak usually surrenders their leverage. Over the following 48 hours, I combed through every digital probate record accessible in the state of Michigan. I searched for a trust, a deed, a filing under Helen's name, but public databases yield nothing when a skilled attorney employs strict privacy shields. The blue folder was the physical key to the legal lock my grandmother had built. I needed to search her room meticulously and quietly before Brenda decided to clear out the remaining furniture and destroy the evidence. 2 days after our tense encounter, I drove back to the Lakeside Memory Care Facility. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a time when the nursing staff is typically focused on shift transitions and medication rounds. I wore my professional clinic badge clipped to my lapel, a subtle psychological prop meant to signal authority. I parked near the staff entrance, grabbed a small bouquet of fresh hydrangeas from the passenger seat, and walked toward the secure wing. The heavy double doors required a front desk override. I pressed the silver intercom button. The receptionist looked up through the safety glass, recognized my face, and reached for the release switch. But before the buzzer could sound, a hand placed itself firmly over the intercom panel. It was Sarah, the charge nurse from my previous visit. Her face was pale and she looked exceptionally uncomfortable. She stepped out from behind the desk and walked through a side door to meet me in the main lobby. "I am so sorry, Audrey," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a hushed, strained register. She held a thick plastic clipboard tight against her chest like a shield. "I cannot let you back there today." I frowned, my mind immediately jumping to clinical emergencies. As a health services manager, I understand infection control protocols and quarantine procedures. I asked if there was a sudden norovirus outbreak on the floor or if Helen had suffered a medical event. Sarah shook her head, her gaze dropping to the polished floor tiles. "It is not a medical lockdown. It is a specific administrative order. Your mother came in yesterday evening. She filed a formal restriction of visitation. The conditioned air in the lobby felt suddenly suffocating. A medical power of attorney grants a designated individual near absolute authority over a patient's healthcare decisions, including who is allowed to enter their physical space. Brenda had weaponized the very bureaucracy I managed for a living. Sarah lifted her clipboard, showing me the freshly printed form bearing my mother's signature. She claims your last visit caused severe agitation. Sarah explained, tracing the black ink with her pen. She documented that Helen experienced a spike in blood pressure and sundowning symptoms immediately after you left. As the primary medical proxy, she has the legal right to bar any visitor she deems detrimental to the patient's well-being. My hands are tied by state regulations. Sarah apologized again, a victim of the system's rigid rules. She was just a nurse trying to protect her license and her facility against a litigious family member. I could not fight her. I could not push past her to reach the secure doors. The law was a physical wall, and Brenda held the only key. I looked at the printed form on the clipboard. The signature was sharp and decisive. Brenda had used my own professional domain against me. She knew I respected the strict rules of clinical compliance. By framing my visit as a medical detriment, she had legally locked me out of my grandmother's life. I could not verify Helen's declining condition. I could not search the small wooden closet for the blue folder. I was completely isolated from the only person who held the truth. "Thank you for letting me know, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice stripped of any emotion. "I will not cause a scene." I turned around and walked back out through the automatic sliding doors. The hydrangeas felt heavy and foolish in my hands. I tossed them into a nearby trash receptacle without breaking my stride. I crossed the asphalt parking lot, the cold wind whipping off the nearby lake and biting through my wool coat. I got into my car and locked the doors, the silence of the cabin wrapping around me. Before I could even insert my keys into the ignition, my cell phone chimed in my pocket. I pulled it out. A new text message from Brenda illuminated the screen. I stared at the words, feeling the exact temperature of the malice hiding beneath her polite punctuation. "Mom just needs peace right now. We carry the family, you just worry about your little job." The message was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It was sickly sweet on the surface, perfectly crafted to look like a concerned daughter. Managing a health crisis, should anyone else ever read it on a subpoenaed record. But underneath the pleasantries, it was a brutal, gloating dismissal. "We carry the family." She was aligning herself directly with Diane, cementing their unholy partnership in the real estate fraud, and explicitly framing me as an outsider who had no jurisdiction over their business. "You just worry about your little job." That was the kill shot. She was mocking my profession, reducing the very expertise that had uncovered her theft into something trivial and pathetic. She wanted me to feel small, powerless, and strictly confined to my cubicle in Grand Rapids. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mother had outmaneuvered me using the standard operating procedures of my own industry. If I filed a formal complaint with the state health department, the investigators would look at the chart, see the documented agitation, and uphold the visitation ban. If I called the local police, they would point to the power of attorney paperwork and label the entire situation a civil family dispute. Brenda had built an impenetrable fortress of compliance around her crimes. I looked up through the windshield at the dark cedar siding of the memory care facility. My grandmother was trapped inside that building, locked in a decaying mind, stripped of her generational assets, and now isolated from the only person actively trying to save her. Playing by the rules was exactly what Brenda expected me to do. The dutiful Midwestern daughter attempts to mediate, attempts to write formal letters of grievance, attempts to appeal to the better angels of a broken family. But dutiful daughters do not win against clinical predators. Bureaucracy is designed to protect the institution, not the victim. The quiet compliance auditor died in that parking lot. I realized I could not win this battle by staying within the neat, predictable lines of administrative procedure. If my mother wanted to use the healthcare system as a weapon, I would stop treating it like a shield. She thought restricting my access would stop the investigation. She failed to realize that restricting a health services manager only forces them to bypass the front desk entirely. I needed to break the protocol. I needed to blow the entire system wide open. The digital clock on my microwave glowed neon green in the dark kitchen. It read 3:14 in the morning. Sleep had become a biological luxury I could no longer afford. I sat at my kitchen island with a cold cup of coffee reviewing the Michigan probate codes for the 50th time, searching for a loophole in a medical proxy restriction. When my cell phone vibrated against the granite counter, the sudden noise sounded like a siren. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I answered on the second ring. "Audrey, it is Elena." The voice was hushed, rushed, and instantly familiar. Elena was a senior night nurse at the Memory Care Center. 5 years ago, she worked under my supervision at the Grand Rapids Clinic before transferring out to the lakeshore for a slower pace. We shared a mutual respect built on navigating difficult patient outcomes. I once caught a severe pharmacy billing error that would have jeopardized her nursing license, a quiet favor she never forgot. "I am standing in the supply closet," Elena whispered. "I know your mother filed a restriction order. If administration catches me calling you, I lose my job." "Why are you calling Elena?" I asked, sitting up straight and pushing the legal printouts away. "It is your grandmother," Elena said. "She is awake. And Audrey, she is having a window." I stopped breathing. In geriatric neurology, a lucid window is a rare, unpredictable phenomenon. Patients suffering from advanced vascular dementia will suddenly experience a spontaneous return of their cognitive faculties. The mental fogs, entirely restoring their memory, their personality, and their sharpest faculties, usually for a very brief, fleeting duration. The medical community still does not fully understand the exact neurological trigger for these moments. "She is asking for you by your full name," Elena continued. "Not your childhood nickname. She knows exactly where she is. If you want to talk to her, you need to get here right now." I unlatched the patio door near the east courtyard. "Park on the street and walk around the perimeter." I threw on my wool coat and grabbed my car keys. The drive through the empty suburban streets felt surreal. The roads were slick with fresh autumn rain reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. I pushed the speed limit, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Sneaking into a locked medical ward violated every single professional code I upheld for a living. If I was caught bypassing a secure entrance, my mother could legally charge me with trespassing, cementing her narrative that I was an unstable, disgruntled relative. But bureaucratic compliance had already failed me. My mother had used the rules to steal our heritage. I had to break the rules to steal it back. I parked 2 blocks away from the facility to avoid the security cameras aimed at the visitor lot. The wind off the lake whipped through the bare branches of the oak trees as I hurried across the wet grass. The east courtyard was shielded by a tall brick wall. I found the glass patio door just as Elena promised. The latch was disengaged. I slipped inside the heavy door, clicking softly shut behind me. The hallway was dimly lit, bathed in the low blue glow of the emergency floor lights. The scent of institutional sanitizer hung in the stagnant air. I moved silently past the sleeping rooms, keeping my footsteps light against the linoleum, counting the numbers until I reached 204. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. A small reading lamp cast a warm yellow pool of light across the bed. Helen was not slumped against her pillows. She was sitting upright, her spine straight, her hands resting calmly on top of the woven blanket. Her silver hair was neatly brushed. I stepped into the light. Her eyes found mine. There was no cloudy hesitation. There was no desperate searching. The pale blue irises were sharp-focused and terrifyingly clear. "You made good time," Audrey Helen said. Her voice was firm, carrying the authoritative cadence of the high school history teacher she used to be. "It is 3:42 in the morning on a Thursday." I stood frozen near the foot of the bed, absorbing the shock of her lucidity. She looked at the digital clock on her bedside table, then back at me. "I purchased the Traverse City property on the 12th of August, 1982, Helen stated, delivering the facts with deliberate precision. The interest rates were high that summer. I paid exactly $64,500. Your grandfather thought I was overpaying for a tear-down cabin, but I knew the foundation was solid cedar. She was proving her capacity to me. She was establishing her cognitive baseline, offering irrefutable evidence that the fog had retreated. She remembered the date, the time, and the exact financial metrics of the asset my mother had just stolen. I walked over and sat on the edge of the mattress, my clinical armor dissolving into profound relief. "She sold it, Grandma," I whispered, fearing the news might shatter the delicate architecture of her restored mind. Brenda sold the cottage to Greg and his new holding company. Helen did not flinch. Her expression hardened, settling into a mask of cold maternal fury. "I know she did," Helen replied, her tone dipping into a dangerous register. "I saw the greed taking root in her months ago. She spent all summer pacing the property line, calculating the square footage, asking questions about the appraisal value. She thinks she is the smartest person in the family. She thinks because my mind wanders, my signature died. It didn't. My grandmother had spent her entire life building a stable harbor for our family. She endured the lean years working double shifts to pay the property taxes when my grandfather fell ill. The cottage was never meant to be a financial commodity. It was a generational anchor, a place designed to keep the family tied together when the world outside grew turbulent. Brenda had looked at that sacred anchor and seen only unliquidated cash. The betrayal was profound, but Helen was not a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a strategist who had anticipated the attack. "I tried to tell you the other day." Helen continued, reaching out to grasp my wrist. Her grip was astonishingly strong, fueled by righteous anger. Before Brenda interrupted us, "I tried to warn you about the water. You mentioned a blue folder," I said, leaning closer, hyper-aware that this window of clarity could close at any second. "You said you locked the water away." Helen turned her head and looked at the heavy oak nightstand situated next to her bed. It was an antique piece, dark wood with brass handles carved with a nautical motif along the edges. When Brenda moved Helen into the facility, Helen had fought a bitter screaming battle to bring that specific piece of furniture from the lake house. Brenda had deemed it a sentimental quirk of the disease and allowed it. "I brought the lock with me," Helen said, her eyes gleaming with a fierce, quiet triumph. I knew Brenda would tear the cottage apart looking for valuables. I knew she would search my desk. So I hid the instructions where she would never think to look. Right next to my own bed. Helen let go of my wrist and took my hand, lacing her fingers through mine. The warmth of her skin grounded me in the surreal reality of the room. We were two women surrounded by sleeping patients and locked doors, plotting a legal counteroffensive in the dead of night. "There is a false bottom under the bottom drawer," Helen instructed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You will need to reach underneath and press the release catch near the back panel, but you cannot do it right now. The night shift does room checks at 4 in the morning. If they catch you in here, Brenda will have you arrested." She squeezed my fingers, her gaze boring into my soul with an intensity that burned away the last remnants of my fear. "Call David. Tell him it's time to open the drawer." The heavy mahogany nightstand stood like a silent sentinel beside the four-poster bed, its polished surface reflecting the pale moonlight that filtered through the sheer curtains. The air in the bedroom felt thick and stagnant, heavy with the scent of aged cedar and the sharp metallic tang of pure adrenaline. Audrey dropped to her knees on the faded floral rug, her eyes scanning the intricate carvings of the antique furniture. By the partially open bedroom door, Helen stood as a fragile but unyielding silhouette against the dim hallway illumination. Her head tilted to listen for any sound of a returning vehicle. The silence stretched between them, taut and fragile, amplifying the rapid thudding of Audrey's heart. Audrey reached out her fingertips, grazing the cool wood. This piece of furniture had been a fixture of her childhood summers, a mysterious monolith that always smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil. Now it was the focal point of their desperate rebellion. Helen whispered her instructions, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic circumstances of the evening. She told Audrey to remove the bottom drawer completely and reach underneath the wooden frame. Audrey complied instantly, gripping the ornate brass handles with trembling hands. The drawer slid forward with a soft, protesting squeak. She lifted it free of its ancient wooden tracks and set it gently on the rug behind her. The dark, dusty cavity of the nightstand yawned open. Taking a shallow breath to calm her nerves, Audrey slid her arm into the narrow gap beneath the lowest shelf. Her fingers traced the rough, unfinished pine lining the interior. She felt nothing but splinters and ancient cobwebs. A sudden spike of panic pierced her chest. She worried that her grandmother's slipping memory had finally fractured reality, completely leading them on a wild goose chase based on a delusion. However, she pushed the doubt aside, recalling the sharp, lucid gleam in the older woman's eyes just moments ago. Audrey stretched her shoulder further against the floorboards, searching the absolute back corner of the wooden enclosure. Her index finger brushed against a small, cold irregularity hidden within the grain of the wood. It felt like a tiny metal toggle switch. Audrey pressed it firmly. A satisfying, distinct click echoed in the quiet room. The entire base of the nightstand dropped half an inch. A false bottom had released. She wedged her fingernails into the newly formed seam and pried the thin wooden panel upward, exposing a shallow secret compartment. Nestled inside lay a thick, pristine legal envelope. It looked completely incongruous against the dusty antique wood, its bright white paper crisp and immaculate. But what truly caught Audrey's attention, stealing the breath from her lungs, was the way the packet was secured. A piece of bright blue sailing twine wrapped tightly around the middle, finished in a flawless square knot. Audrey lifted the envelope, feeling the rough texture of the braided nylon against her skin. A profound wave of nostalgia washed over her. This was not just any string. It was a section of the halyard line from the dilapidated sunfish sailboat they used to keep tied to the lakeside dock. The memory rushed back with vivid, sunlit clarity. Audrey remembered being 10 years old, sunburned and laughing, sitting on the wooden deck while Helen patiently taught her how to tie knots. Helen used to say that a good knot holds fast when the wind blows hard, her strong hands guiding Audrey's clumsy fingers. The blue twine was a message, a tactile anchor to their shared heritage, proving unequivocally that the woman who prepared this envelope was completely in possession of her faculties and her heart. Helen moved slowly away from the door, abandoning her lookout post for a moment, to gaze down at her granddaughter. A soft, satisfied smile touched her wrinkled cheeks. She noted that Audrey remembered the old boat. Audrey agreed, her voice tight with unshed tears, and asked her grandmother what the envelope contained. Helen gestured for Audrey to open it. Her expression hardening into a look of fierce determination, she explained that a little over a year ago she started noticing the shadows creeping into her mind. She would forget where she put her reading glasses, or she would occasionally call Audrey by her mother's name. It terrified her. But what terrified her far more was the way Aunt Brenda looked at her when she made those inevitable mistakes. The look was never born of concern. It was pure calculation. Audrey slid the blue twine off the paper, listening intently. She knew Brenda had always been mercenary, a woman who measured success entirely by square footage and designer labels. But she had never wanted to believe her aunt was truly malicious. Growing up, Brenda would complain bitterly about the cost of maintaining the lake house, frequently demanding that Helen sell it to fund Brenda's failed business ventures. Brenda's recent actions, isolating Helen and seizing control of her finances under the guise of caregiving, had finally shattered any remaining illusion of familial loyalty. Helen took a slow, painful breath and continued her explanation. She knew Brenda held her medical and financial power of attorney. Audrey's grandfather had set those documents up decades ago, assuming Brenda was the responsible older sibling. But Helen saw the greed taking root deeply. She knew Brenda would try to steal the cottage eventually. Brenda always hated the lake, hated the maintenance, and hated the rustic charm of the property. To Brenda, this beloved sanctuary was merely a pile of cash waiting to be liquidated. Audrey pulled a thick sheaf of heavy watermarked paper from the envelope. The legal jargon printed across the pages was dense, but the bold heading across the top sheet was impossible to miss. It was a property deed executed and officially recorded by the county clerk precisely 14 months ago. Helen explained that she could not confront Brenda directly. If she had challenged her daughter, Brenda would have invoked her power of attorney, immediately declared Helen mentally incompetent and locked her in a care facility before the week concluded. Therefore, Helen decided to fight quietly. While Brenda was away on one of her lavish luxury cruises, Helen called an independent lawyer located in Traverse City. She chose a professional with absolutely no connection to Brenda or her wealthy country club friends. Audrey scanned the documents, her eyes widening as she parsed the complicated legal terminology. She noticed the official stamp at the bottom of the signature page and realized her grandmother had hired a mobile notary. Helen confirmed this fact with a defiant nod, stating that the notary came right to their kitchen table. Together with the lawyer on the phone, they executed a ladybird deed. Helen explained that this is a special type of enhanced life estate deed, unique to states like Michigan. It allowed Helen to retain complete, absolute control over the property during her lifetime. She could live in the house rented out, or even change her mind, all without needing anyone's permission or approval. Audrey read the subsequent pages, the scattered puzzle pieces of her grandmother's behavior finally slamming into place with staggering force. The ladybird deed did not merely protect Helen while she was alive. It dictated exactly what happened the moment her legal ownership transferred. Audrey traced her own name printed in bold black ink and realized Helen had put the cottage directly into an irrevocable trust. Helen affirmed the discovery. The trust listed Audrey as the sole beneficiary and the absolute owner of the property upon the transfer. Because it was an enhanced life estate deed, utilized in conjunction with the trust, the cottage passed completely outside of the standard probate process. It became entirely exempt from the personal estate Brenda was currently attempting to control. Furthermore, because the trust was irrevocable, Brenda's standard financial power of attorney was rendered completely useless against it. Brenda possessed authority over Helen's personal bank accounts, but she held absolutely no jurisdiction over the house or the land it sat upon. Audrey stared at the printed words, her mind racing to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what her grandmother had accomplished in secret. For 14 long months, Helen had played the role of the frail, forgetful old woman. She had endured Brenda's patronizing behavior, suffered through her suffocating control, and swallowed her pride, all while holding an ironclad legal shield over their family legacy. Then the true reality of their current situation hit Audrey like a physical blow. The breath rushed from her lungs in a sharp gasp. She looked up at Helen, her eyes wide with a potent mixture of awe and absolute terror. Just 3 hours ago, Brenda had marched into the living room, accompanied by a slick real estate developer. Audrey had seen the mountain of paperwork spread across the coffee table. Brenda had used her financial power of attorney to sign a binding purchase agreement, accepting a massive cash transfer to close the sale of the lakefront property immediately. Brenda believed she had the legal right to liquidate the asset on Helen's behalf, bypassing standard title insurance waiting periods by utilizing a private cash buyer. But Brenda did not own the house. Helen's power of attorney did not apply to a property held securely within this specific trust. The legal transfer of the deed had already occurred permanently, binding and officially recorded by the county government over a year ago. Brenda had just signed closing documents, accepted a massive sum of money from a ruthless corporate development firm, and legally transferred the title to a house she had absolutely no right to sell. Audrey slowly stood up from the faded rug, clutching the crucial documents tightly to her chest. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her throughout the night suddenly evaporated, quickly replaced by a cold, crystalline realization. Her aunt had not just made a selfish mistake or acted out of mere greed. By signing those official papers and taking that corporate money, Brenda had knowingly bypassed property checks using her fraudulent authority. She had crossed a massive, irreversible legal boundary. Brenda had just committed millions of dollars in catastrophic real estate fraud. The sun breached the horizon as I pulled out of the memory care facility parking lot. The Michigan sky shifted from a bruised purple to a cold slate gray. My passenger seat held my clinical clipboard and the heavy envelope bound in blue sailing twine. My mother had barred me from visiting my grandmother, assuming she had severed my access to the truth. She did not realize she had trapped herself in a legal snare of her own making. I drove straight to my apartment in Grand Rapids, showered and changed into a tailored charcoal suit. I pinned my clinic badge to my lapel. Today, I was not acting as a grieving family member. I was operating as a health services manager, executing a compliance audit. At precisely 8 o'clock, I dialed the phone number printed on the letterhead inside the envelope. A gruff voice answered on the third ring. David Vance operated a small independent law practice in a historic brick building near the Traverse City waterfront. He specialized in elder law, navigating the complex intersection of probate courts, Medicare recovery, and vulnerable adult protections. When I mentioned Helen and the blue twine, a heavy sigh crackled over the receiver. He instructed me to drive north immediately. The journey took 2 hours. I spent the time rehearsing the timeline mentally, aligning the medical charts with the property records. David Vance occupied an office that felt like a museum of Michigan jurisprudence. The air smelled of old paper binding glue and stale coffee. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held decades of hardbound legal statutes, a stark contrast to the sterile digital environments I managed daily. David sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He wore a worn tweed blazer and wire-rimmed glasses. He possessed the quiet, observant demeanor of a man who had spent 30 years watching families tear themselves apart over inheritances. I handed him the envelope. He untied the blue nylon cord with a fond, knowing smile. "She told me she would hide it where the vultures would never look," David said, smoothing the heavy deed flat on his blotter. "Your grandmother was a remarkable strategist, Audrey. She sat right in that leather chair across from me 14 months ago. She knew the vascular dementia was progressing. She felt the shadows lengthening, and she knew exactly what your mother intended to do." I sat down, gripping the edges of my clinical clipboard. Brenda monitored all of her bank. I stated, analyzing the logistics. My mother tracked every penny to ensure Helen was not spending down the assets she wanted to inherit. How did my grandmother afford your retainer without triggering an alert on the monthly statements? David leaned back, taking off his glasses. He wiped the lenses with a microfiber cloth. "She paid me in cash." He revealed, his voice filled with profound respect. "She recognized the financial surveillance early. For nearly a year before she came to me, Helen skimmed small amounts from her own grocery budget. $20 here, $50 there. She hid the cash inside empty coffee tins in the pantry. She built a secret legal defense fund out of coupon savings just to keep Brenda from seeing the ledger deductions." The image of my grandmother meticulously hoarding $20 bills to protect our family heritage sent a sharp ache through my chest. It was a tangible, heartbreaking testament to her resilience. Helen had fought her own decaying mind and her greedy daughter simultaneously. "The Ladybird deed is properly executed," I said, shifting back to the administrative reality. It transferred the remainder interest of the cottage into an irrevocable trust the moment the neurologist deemed her incapacitated. But Brenda just closed a sale on that exact property yesterday. How did the buyer's title company miss a recorded deed? David placed his glasses back on his face. "The buyer is an LLC owned by your mother's romantic partner, correct? They utilized a cut-rate title agency looking for a rapid closing. I filed this Ladybird deed under a specific privacy trust utilizing your grandmother's maiden name. When that shady title company ran their hurried search on Helen Gerson, they missed the secondary trust filing. It is a quiet title defect. Brenda signed a warranty deed guaranteeing she held clear title, accepted the wire transfer, and finalized the sale of a house she has no legal right to convey. She committed real estate fraud. I confirmed the gravity of the crime settling into the dusty room. But Brenda will claim Helen lacked the cognitive capacity to create this trust 14 months ago. She will argue the deed is invalid due to dementia." David smiled, a slow, predatory expression that told me he had anticipated this exact counterattack. "I do not leave loose ends, Audrey. Neither did your grandmother." He picked up his desk phone and pressed a single intercom button. A moment later, the heavy wooden door opened. A woman in her late 40s stepped into the office. She wore a practical navy pantsuit and carried a thick leather logbook. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the room with meticulous precision. "Audrey," David said, gesturing to the newcomer. "This is Sarah. She is an independent mobile notary. I utilize her services for all high-risk estate planning." Sarah took a seat next to me. "I evaluate capacity for a living." She explained, her tone crisp and professional. When David called me to Helen's dining room table 14 months ago, I did not just stamp a piece of paper. I conducted a standard cognitive screening. I asked your grandmother to identify the current date, the sitting president, and the exact nature of the documents she was signing. I asked her to explain the consequences of an irrevocable trust in her own words. Sarah opened her leather logbook and turned to a dog-eared page. She answered every question flawlessly, the notary continued. She even corrected my math on a property tax estimation. I documented her lucid state in my official journal, and I took an unedited audio recording of our conversation on my phone, which is securely backed up in David's digital vault. If your mother tries to claim Helen was incompetent on the day of signing, I will gladly sit on a witness stand and read this logbook to a judge. The trap was flawless. Brenda had built a house of cards on a foundation she thought she controlled. She had sold property out of greed, restricted my visitation rights out of spite, and tried to buy my silence with stolen money. She was currently holding a large wire transfer for a voided transaction. The legal consequences for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult carried severe mandatory minimum sentences in our state. David folded his hands on top of the deed. We hold all the cards, Audrey. The only question remaining is how you want to play them. I looked at the seasoned attorney, waiting for his recommendation. We can handle this quietly, David proposed. I can draft a stern demand letter and send it to your mother's attorney via certified mail. We present the Ladybird deed, the notary log, and the trust documents. We force Brenda to unwind the fraudulent sale, return the cash to her boyfriend's LLC, and step down as the medical proxy voluntarily. She avoids a criminal referral, the family name stays out of the local newspapers, and you assume guardianship of Helen without a protracted court battle. It is swift and surgical. He paused, letting the conservative option hang in the quiet office. Or, David added, his voice dropping an octave, we can handle it loudly. We file an emergency injunction in the probate court. We serve her with a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty. We refer the fraudulent warranty deed to the county prosecutor for criminal wire fraud investigation. It will be messy. It will decimate her social standing, but it will permanently strip her of any ability to harm your grandmother again. I sat in the leather chair, feeling the weight of the decision. A quiet resolution would maintain the polite Midwestern facade my family prized above all else. It would allow Brenda and Diane to slink away bruised, but largely unpunished for their cruelty. They would continue hosting lavish Sunday dinners, pretending their wealth was legitimate, rewriting the narrative to make themselves the victims of a legal technicality. I thought about the cheap pink plastic hairbrush sitting in Helen's drawer. I thought about the heavy cream envelope Diane clutched in the driveway, crying about private school tuition while funding it with stolen heritage. I thought about my grandmother trapped behind locked doors, smoothing a blanket with trembling hands, terrified that the water was being taken away. I looked down at the clinical clipboard resting in my lap. My professional life was dedicated to enforcing accountability. When a provider endangers a patient, you do not send a polite letter asking them to stop. You revoke their credentials, you expose their malpractice, and you ensure they never hold authority over a vulnerable person again. I lifted my head and met the elder law attorney's gaze. The quiet compliance auditor was gone, replaced entirely by a woman ready to dismantle her own family. We do not send a letter, I said, my voice echoing off the rows of heavy law books. We do it loudly. In front of her audience. In the healthcare industry, ambushes are never conducted in dark alleys or empty parking lots. They occur under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, scheduled via automated calendar invites and mandated by strict state compliance codes. I did not need to lure my mother to the memory care facility with a fabricated medical emergency or a deceptive phone call. I simply utilized the vast, unforgiving bureaucratic machinery she thought she had already mastered. Under Michigan Department of Health and Human Services guidelines, any immediate family member can formally request a comprehensive care plan meeting for a relative residing in a licensed care facility. It is a fundamental patient right designed to ensure transparency in long-term care. When such a request is lodged and documented with the facility administration, the primary medical proxy cannot decline to attend. Refusing a mandatory care review triggers an automatic administrative flag within the state system. It invites state surveyors to audit the patient file for potential financial abuse or medical neglect. Brenda prized her pristine public's image above all else, and she lived in perpetual fear of legal scrutiny from outsiders. She would never risk an unannounced state audit. She had no choice but to show up. I scheduled the meeting for 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. The facility conference room was a windowless, sterile rectangle designed specifically for delivering difficult diagnoses and discussing end-of-life care. It featured a faux wood laminate table 6, uncomfortable vinyl chairs, and the persistent low hum of a commercial heating and cooling system rattling overhead. The air smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and stale coffee. I arrived 30 minutes early to secure my position. I sat at the far end of the long table arranging my clinical clipboard, a sharp pen, and a blank legal pad. I wore my tailored charcoal suit, the exact same outfit I wore to defend my clinic during federal inspections. I was not a grieving granddaughter visiting a sick relative. I was an auditor initiating a targeted investigation, and I was going to strip my family of their illusions. At 5 minutes past the hour, the heavy wooden door swung open. Brenda entered first, bringing the crisp autumn chill of the lakeside parking lot into the stagnant room. Diane flanked her, closely matching her stride. They looked less like relatives visiting a locked dementia ward, and more like wealthy patrons arriving at an exclusive charity luncheon. My mother wore a brand new tailored camel hair coat that draped flawlessly over her shoulders. Diane wore a striking, full-length leather trench coat with gleaming brass hardware. My sister had spent the last 3 years dodging relentless calls from commercial creditors crying over her failing boutique and wearing out-of-season clearance rack sweaters to family events. Her business was suffocating under a mountain of debt. Today, however, Diane looked flushed with fresh stolen prosperity. The $200,000 from the fraudulent limited liability company transfer had clearly hit their respective bank accounts. They were wearing my grandmother's liquidated legacy on their backs, parading the spoils of their elder fraud through the very halls where the victim sat trapped in a decaying mind. Brenda did not acknowledge my presence at the end of the table immediately. Instead, she turned her full attention to the facility social worker and the unit charge nurse who had followed them into the conference room. Brenda held up a grease-stained pink cardboard box. She had stopped at a cheap discount bakery chain on her way to the facility. "I know how hard you girls work," Brenda crooned, setting the bright pink box on the edge of the conference table and opening the lid to reveal a dozen waxy processed donuts. "Taking care of our sweet Helen is such a heavy burden for everyone. I wanted to bring a little treat today to show my deep appreciation for everything your team does. You are all true angels." It was a staggering display of performative benevolence. My mother had just executed a 6-figure real estate heist, stripping an incapacitated senior citizen of her primary generational asset through forgery and self-dealing. Yet she stood in a clinical conference room expecting gratitude and validation in exchange for $10 worth of stale, mass-produced pastries. She was performing the role of the devoted, exhausted matriarch. The nurses thanked her politely, their smiles strained by genuine fatigue, entirely unaware of the felony wire fraud that had funded the affluent woman standing before them. The social worker, a young woman named Megan, patted her thick clinical binder. "I just need to grab the updated medication administration logs from the main nursing station before we begin the formal review," Megan explained, gesturing toward the hallway. "We will give your family a few minutes of privacy to get settled and discuss any preliminary concerns." The staff exited, pulling the heavy door shut, until the latch clicked softly in the sterile room. The captive audience was gone. The grand performance instantly dissolved. Brenda dropped her benevolent maternal smile. Her features hardened into a mask of cold annoyance. She took the seat directly across the table from me, carefully unbuttoning her expensive camel hair coat so the premium fabric would not wrinkle against the vinyl chair. Diane sat next to her, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. The premium leather of her new jacket creaked loudly in the quiet space, a sharp auditory reminder of her complicity. "This is incredibly petty, Audrey," Brenda started. Her voice was sharp, carrying the precise, condescending tone she historically used to dismiss unruly teenagers. "Forcing a mandatory care review on a Friday afternoon is a ridiculous stunt. You are wasting my valuable time, and you are wasting the medical staff's time. I know you are upset about the lake house, but throwing a bureaucratic temper tantrum changes nothing." I kept my hands resting flat on either side of my clipboard. I did not raise my voice. "The house is not yours to sell." Diane let out a loud, mocking sigh, rolling her eyes toward the fluorescent lights. She leaned forward, emboldened by her new financial security and the physical presence of our mother. "Are you really still doing this? Mom offered you a very generous envelope on Sunday night. You chose to leave $20,000 sitting on the dining room table. That was your own foolish mistake. You do not get to drag us into a windowless room and pretend you possess any actual authority here. The real estate sale is final. The money is secured in our accounts. It is over. Brenda placed a manicured hand over Diane's wrist, gently signaling her older daughter to quiet down. My mother wanted to deliver the finishing blow herself. She leaned across the faux wood laminate table, her eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits that contained no trace of familial affection. She looked at me as if I were a persistent, annoying insect that needed to be permanently crushed. You need to accept the reality of the finances. Audrey Brenda stated, her tone dripping with toxic self-righteousness. Helen is failing rapidly. Her mind is entirely gone. She is a hollow shell of the strong woman she used to be. The Traverse City cottage was a depreciating asset that required constant expensive maintenance we can no longer afford. I made the hard, responsible choice to liquidate that property to cover the exorbitant costs of her memory care. I am the one shouldering the emotional burden of this family. I am the one making the tough, pragmatic calls while you sit in judgment. Brenda tapped her polished fingernail against the table for emphasis, the sharp sound echoing in the small room. She was attempting to gaslight me, rewriting the narrative of her theft into a story of maternal sacrifice. You are going to stop causing drama. My mother commanded, her voice dropping into a menacing whisper. You are going to stop harassing the nursing staff with your pointless questions. You are going to stop digging into financial matters that do not concern you. I hold the power of attorney. If you continue to push this issue, I will have the facility administration permanently bar you from the premises. I will ensure you never see Helen again. You will be entirely cut off. Do you understand me? I stared at the woman who had raised me. I catalogued the tailored coat, the fresh salon manicure, and the unwavering certainty in her eyes. She genuinely believed she had won the war. She believed her forged timelines and restricted visitation orders had formed an impenetrable shield against any consequences. She thought she was disciplining a naive, rebellious daughter who did not understand how the real world operated. She had no idea she was speaking to the sole beneficiary of an irrevocable trust armed with a ladybird deed and a recorded notary log. I did not blink. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I let her brutal ultimatum hang in the stale, recycled air for 5 long, agonizing seconds. I allowed her to savor her perceived victory, letting her arrogant confidence peak. Then the heavy brass handle on the conference room door clicked loudly. The metal hinges groaned as the door swung outward into the hallway. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, keeping my expression perfectly clinical, and delivered my response. I accept the reality perfectly, I said. That is why I brought outside counsel. David Vance walked into the windowless conference room with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who had spent 3 decades dismantling arrogant heirs in probate court. He wore his standard tweed blazer, carrying a scuffed leather briefcase that looked older than I was. The brass latches on the bag clinked softly in the quiet space. Right behind him stepped Sarah, the independent mobile notary, clad in a practical navy pantsuit and clutching her thick, bound official logbook tightly against her chest. They did not look like facility medical staff, and they certainly did not look like sympathetic family mediators. They looked exactly like what they were. They were the legal executioners of my mother's grand illusion. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind them, the metal latch clicking into place with a sound that felt remarkably like a jail cell locking. The smug, victorious smirk on Brenda's face faltered instantly. She sat up straight, her spine stiffening against the uncomfortable vinyl chairback. For a brief, fleeting second, genuine confusion clouded her meticulously made-up features. My mother was accustomed to controlling every single variable within her designated sphere of influence. Strangers entering her mandated care plan meeting violated that strict control. She glanced at the facility social worker's empty chair, then looked back at David and Sarah, her eyes narrowing as her brain scrambled to assess the sudden new threat level. Diane was halfway through chewing a powdered donut she had taken from the grease-stained pink cardboard box. She froze. My older sister had spent her entire adult life running from relentless commercial creditors, dodging phone calls from collections departments, and surviving on the frayed edge of financial ruin. That constant grinding state of anxiety had gifted her an animalistic instinct for impending doom. She sensed the sudden, catastrophic shift in the room's power dynamic before a single word was even spoken. Diane slowly lowered the half-eaten pastry onto a thin paper napkin. Her hands were visibly shaking. She pulled her arms tight against her chest, wrapping the expensive new leather trench coat around herself like a protective shield. She shrank back into her chair, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit. Brenda recovered her composure, quickly substituting her brief confusion with immediate bristling outrage. She stood up, smoothing the front of her premium camel hair coat in a gesture of pure defensive posturing. "Excuse me," Brenda snapped, her voice sharp, loud, and echoing harshly against the sterile walls. "This is a private medical conference regarding my mother. Who are you people and how did you get past the front desk?" David did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or match her combative energy. He simply set his battered briefcase on the edge of the faux wood laminate table and snapped the brass latches open. The sound was loud and profoundly final. "Audrey," Brenda warned, turning her venom toward me, assuming I had hired amateur advocates to plead my case. "If these are friends of yours, you need to tell them to leave right now. I am the legal medical proxy here. I hold the authority in this facility. I will call security this instant and have you all escorted off the premises. I will file a harassment complaint with the state licensing board against your clinic." "There will be no need for security, Mrs. Gerson," David said gently. His voice was polite, coated in that specific, excruciatingly calm tone seasoned attorneys use when they hold every winning card in the deck. "My name is David Vance. I am an estate attorney based in Traverse City. And this is Sarah Mitchell, a licensed notary public for the state of Michigan. I do not represent your daughter Audrey. I represent your mother Helen. I have served as her personal legal counsel for over a year." Brenda stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The assertion that her incapacitated mother possessed independent legal representation simply did not compute within the arrogant framework she had constructed. Helen was supposed to be a helpless victim, a woman lost in a cognitive fog entirely dependent on Brenda's mercy. The idea that Helen had secretly retained a lawyer while Brenda was busy measuring the lake house for renovations shattered her entire worldview. David reached into his briefcase and extracted a thick stack of heavy, watermarked paper. He placed it squarely in the center of the table, right next to the pink cardboard donut box Brenda had brought to buy the staff's affection. 14 months ago, David continued, his tone remaining perfectly conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than destroying a life. "Your mother retained my services. She was deeply concerned about the future management of her assets. Together, we executed a comprehensive estate plan, which included an enhanced life estate transfer commonly known as a ladybird deed. She placed the Traverse City property into an irrevocable trust." David slid a copy of the recorded deed across the table toward Brenda. She did not reach for it. She stared at the bold black text on the top page as if it were a venomous snake. "You hold a standard durable power of attorney, Mrs. Gerson," David explained, weaponizing his polite legal terminology. "But when Helen established this specific trust, she explicitly revoked your authority regarding any and all real estate transactions. You lost the legal right to manage, encumber, or sell the lake house more than a year ago. The document you rely upon to assert your dominance was legally neutered before your mother ever moved into this facility." The room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Diane let out a soft whimpering sound, pressing her hands over her mouth. She suddenly realized the $20,000 cashier check she had deposited earlier that week was not a gift. It was the proceeds of a major crime, making her an accessory after the fact. "I understand you recently orchestrated a sale of this property to a limited liability company," David said, leaning forward slightly, resting his knuckles on the table. "I must inform you that the transaction is fundamentally void. You signed a warranty deed on behalf of an estate you had no legal jurisdiction over. Our office filed the deed under a privacy trust name, which is why your buyer's negligent title agency missed it during their preliminary search. The title company will be notifying your buyer this afternoon that the transfer is invalid." David let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing the dense legal reality to settle over the room. "According to the financial records we subpoenaed this morning, Your buyer wired $300,000 to your personal accounts to close this transaction. Because you possessed no authority to sell the asset, you did not conduct a real estate deal. You conducted a theft. You are currently holding $300,000 of stolen, unlaundered cash. The word unlaundered hung in the air, transforming a polite family dispute into a devastating criminal reality. Brenda stumbled backward, the back of her knees hitting the vinyl chair. She fell heavily into the seat. All the vibrant color drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly ashen gray. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. The smug, condescending matriarch who had marched into the room expecting to crush her youngest daughter was entirely gone. She was staring directly into the abyss. I sat perfectly still at my end of the table, my hands resting lightly on my clinical clipboard. In healthcare administration, you learn to observe the exact moment a corrupt provider realizes their fraud has been discovered. It is a distinct psychological collapse. I watched my mother experience that collapse in real time. She realized in that terrible, suffocating moment that she had not just been caught in a petty family lie about a house. She had stepped blindly into a devastating legal trap set by the very woman she thought she had outsmarted. The money she and Diane were wearing on their backs, the funds they thought would secure their respective lifestyles, were now radioactive evidence of a severe crime. Brenda had not merely overstepped her familial boundaries. She had been caught in a federal wire fraud and state elder abuse snare, and the jaws had just snapped shut. The silence in the windowless conference room shattered the moment Brenda found her voice. The shock that had paralyzed her muscles evaporated, replaced entirely by the frantic, cornered rage of a predator caught in a snare. She slammed her hands flat against the faux wood laminate table. The plastic coffee cups rattled. The pink donut box shifted. "This is a complete fabrication!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking under the strain of her own rising panic. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the recorded deed resting in the center of the table. "That piece of paper is a fake. It is a pathetic, desperate forgery. My mother has been out of her mind for years. She was crazy long before she moved into this facility. She lacked the basic cognitive capacity to tie her own shoes, let alone execute an irrevocable trust. Any judge in the state of Michigan will look at her medical chart and throw this ridiculous document straight into the garbage." Brenda turned her furious gaze toward David Vance, her chest heaving beneath the expensive camel hair coat. "You are a predatory lawyer trying to steal my family estate. I am going to have you disbarred. I am going to sue you for everything you own." David did not blink. He simply tilted his head, deferring the response to the woman sitting beside him. Sarah Mitchell, the mobile notary, did not raise her voice to match my mother. She operated with the cold, methodical precision of an expert witness who had testified in countless contentious probate hearings. She reached out and pulled her thick leather-bound logbook closer. She opened it to the dog-eared page she had referenced earlier, smoothing the paper flat with her palm. "I do not forge documents, Mrs. Gerson," Sarah stated calmly. She slid the heavy logbook across the table until it rested mere inches from Brenda's shaking hands. "And your mother was not crazy. On the morning of October 14th, I sat across from Helen at her dining room table. Before I presented a single legal document, I administered a standard mental capacity evaluation designed specifically to withstand a probate challenge." Sarah tapped her pen against the detailed notes written in crisp blue ink. "I asked your mother to state her full legal name, her date of birth, and her current physical address." Sarah continued reading directly from the official record. She answered flawlessly. "I asked her to identify the current sitting president and the governor of Michigan." She provided both names without hesitation. I then asked her to explain the fundamental purpose of a ladybird deed. Your mother looked me in the eye and stated she was creating an enhanced life estate to protect her home from her daughter's financial mismanagement. She articulated the exact mechanism of the irrevocable trust. She even provided the historical purchase price of the property and calculated the estimated capital gains tax on a hypothetical sale. She was sharper than most of the corporate executives I notarize for. Brenda stared at the logbook. Her eyes darted across the meticulous handwriting, searching for a flaw, a discrepancy, a single weakness she could exploit. There was none. The record was impregnable. I also recorded the entire 40-minute evaluation on a secure digital audio file," Sarah added, delivering the final crushing piece of evidence. Her voice is clear. Her intent is unambiguous. You cannot successfully challenge her capacity because I documented it with overwhelming proof. Brenda recoiled, pulling her hands back from the table as if the logbook had burned her skin. She looked around the room, her gaze darting frantically from David to Sarah, and finally settling on me. She opened her mouth to launch another volley of threats to assert her dominance as the matriarch, but I did not give her the opportunity to breathe. I utilized the exact voice I reserve for hostile clinical providers who attempt to bypass safety regulations. It is a tone entirely stripped of emotion, devoid of empathy, and perfectly calibrated to convey absolute authority. I shed the identity of the dutiful, quiet daughter completely. I became the administrator of her ruin. "You are out of options, Brenda," I said. My mother flinched. It was the first time in my life I had addressed her by her first name. The deliberate removal of her maternal title struck her like a physical blow. Under the Michigan Estates and Protected Individuals Code, I continued outlining the consequences with surgical precision. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult is a felony when the stolen amount exceeds $100,000. The penalties include severe mandatory prison sentences and devastating financial restitution. You used a fraudulent document to authorize a real estate sale. You signed a warranty deed claiming clear title when you knew you held no such right. You engaged in felony self-dealing by orchestrating a sweetheart transaction with your own romantic partner. You did not just break family trust. You broke state and federal laws. "You would not dare," Brenda whispered, her voice reduced to a ragged, terrified rasp. "I am your mother. You would not send your own mother to prison over a piece of property. You sent your own mother to a locked dementia ward and tried to steal her legacy while she was trapped in a fog." I replied, the chill in my voice freezing the air between us. "Do not lecture me about family loyalty. You forfeited that defense the moment you took Greg's money." David Vance leaned forward, picking up the threads seamlessly. He was the architect of the legal strategy, and he was ready to deploy the most devastating tactical strike. "Speaking of the money, Mrs. Gerson," David said, his tone polite but lethal. "I informed you earlier that we filed an emergency injunction in the county probate court this morning. The judge reviewed the recorded trust documents, the notary log, and the fraudulent warranty deed. The court found immediate compelling evidence of elder exploitation. Consequently, an ex parte freeze order has been issued." Brenda's eyes widened, the blood draining entirely from her lips. "Every single one of your personal bank accounts is now frozen," David explained, delivering the catastrophic news without a hint of remorse. "The funds you received from the limited liability company cannot be moved, withdrawn, or utilized. Furthermore, the court has frozen Greg Vance's corporate accounts associated with the fraudulent purchase. You cannot access the stolen $300,000. You cannot even hire a criminal defense attorney with those funds because the money is now classified as the proceeds of a felony." The reality of her total destruction finally penetrated Brenda's thick armor of arrogance. She was bankrupt. She was trapped. She was facing imminent criminal charges with zero financial resources to mount a defense. The sound of a muffled sob broke the heavy silence. Diane, who had been sitting frozen in her expensive leather trench coat, suddenly shattered. The golden child, the complicit sister who had forged documents to secure private school tuition, looked at the undeniable mountain of evidence and realized she was about to be swept away in the avalanche. Survival instinct overrode her lifelong loyalty to our mother in a fraction of a second. "I told her not to do it," Diane cried out, her voice pitching into a hysterical, desperate wail. She scrambled backward, pushing her chair away from Brenda as if our mother were suddenly contagious. "I told her it was wrong. She forced me to help her." Brenda whipped her head around, staring at her favorite daughter in absolute disbelief. "Diane, shut your mouth. Do not say another word." "No." Diane screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. She turned her frantic gaze toward David and Sarah, pleading for mercy. She brought the blank authorization forms to my house. She made me sign them as a witness. She told me to backdate my signature to November so the title company would accept the paperwork. I did not want to do it. She manipulated me. She promised the money would save my boutique. I will testify against her. I will tell the prosecutor everything she did. Just please do not let them send me to jail. The betrayal was absolute and instantaneous. Brenda sat motionless, her jaw slack, watching her most loyal accomplice throw her to the wolves to save her own skin. The family unit Brenda had ruled with an iron fist dissolved in front of her eyes, destroyed by the very selfishness she had nurtured within it. I looked at my mother. I looked at the ruined, terrified woman sitting across the table, stripped of her stolen wealth, abandoned by her favorite child, and cornered by the undeniable weight of her own crimes. She had built her entire life around the illusion of control, believing she could outsmart everyone around her, simply because she desired things more ruthlessly than they did. I stood up from my chair and picked up my clinical clipboard. The meeting was over. The audit was complete. The fraudulent enterprise had been permanently dismantled. Brenda looked up at me, her eyes hollow, searching for a trace of the quiet, compliant daughter she used to command. She found nothing but cold, unyielding resolve. I delivered the ultimate blow, letting the words fall like heavy stones onto the faux wood laminate table. You thought her memory was gone? Mom, I said, my voice echoing with the profound, victorious weight of my grandmother's brilliant strategy. But she remembered exactly who you were. When a family structure breaks apart under the weight of a felony, there are no cinematic explosions. There is no dramatic musical score playing in the background to signal the climax of the conflict. The actual collapse is swift, administrative, and exceptionally quiet. It sounds like the rhythmic hum of a copy machine printing court summons in a sterile government building. It sounds like the crisp, definitive click of a detective's pen striking a steno pad. I walked out of that windowless conference room and left my mother sitting in the ruins of her own arrogance. The following weeks were not filled with screaming matches or tearful confrontations. They were filled with the relentless, grinding machinery of the Michigan legal system going to work. David Vance filed the emergency petitions the very next morning. The response from the state was immediate. Adult Protective Services dispatched an investigator to the memory care unit before noon. The investigator, a seasoned social worker who had seen every iteration of familial greed, interviewed the charge nurse and secured Helen's medical chart. Once the state verified the discrepancy between the neurologist's capacity evaluation and the date on the fraudulent warranty deed, the civil matter automatically escalated into a criminal inquiry. Detectives from the County Financial Crimes Division arrived at Brenda's pristine suburban home 48 hours later. They did not call ahead to schedule an appointment. They knocked on her custom mahogany front door, while her affluent neighbors watched from their manicured lawns, serving her with formal subpoenas for her personal bank records. Greg, the boyfriend who thought he had secured a lucrative lakeside flip, was the first casualty of the investigation. He built his career acquiring distressed real estate and exploiting vulnerable sellers. He knew how to calculate a bad investment, and he recognized a sinking ship the moment the prosecutor froze his corporate accounts. Initially, he attempted to hide behind the liability protections of his newly formed holding company. But when the district attorney pierced the corporate veil and presented him with a draft indictment for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, Greg calculated his odds of survival. He did not hire a defense attorney to fight for my mother. He hired one to negotiate his own immunity. Greg provided the authorities with every text message and email Brenda had sent him plotting the discounted sale. In exchange for avoiding a state prison cell, he flipped on his partner, invalidated the transaction, and surrendered the fraudulent deed back to the trust. He abandoned Brenda the exact same way Diane had evaporating from her life in a single afternoon. Diane tried to cling to the wreckage, desperate to salvage some semblance of her former security. 3 days after the disastrous care plan meeting, my cell phone vibrated on my desk at the clinic. A text message from my older sister illuminated the screen. I did not need to open the application to read the preview. A dense, frantic block of text scrolled across the glass. She claimed she was emotionally manipulated, that she was blinded by the stress of her failing boutique, that she truly loved me and Helen, and that we needed to heal as a family. She begged for an opportunity to explain herself over coffee. I looked at the glowing words and felt a profound, echoing emptiness. I felt no anger, no pity, and no desire for reconciliation. In healthcare administration, you learn that a toxic element must be permanently excised to save the healthy tissue surrounding it. I swiped the notification to the left and pressed delete without opening the message. I blocked her contact number, permanently severing her access to my life. The legal machinery ground forward, culminating in a hearing at the county probate court in Grand Rapids. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old oak. Brenda sat at the respondent's table, looking small and fragile inside her oversized coat. The presiding judge reviewed the mobile notary logbook, the irrevocable trust documents, and the voided warranty deed. He did not attempt to hide his judicial disgust. With a swift, echoing strike of his gavel, the judge revoked Brenda's proxy authority entirely. I stood before the polished wooden bench, raised my right hand, and was officially sworn in as Helen's emergency guardian and sole conservator. The legal power to protect my grandmother finally rested exactly where it belonged. However, the civil victory was merely the prologue to my mother's ultimate ruin. The state does not tolerate those who prey on the elderly. The prosecutor formally charged Brenda with 2 counts of financial fraud against a vulnerable adult. The frozen bank accounts meant she could not access the stolen funds to pay for her mounting legal bills. To hire a competent criminal defense attorney and satisfy the court-ordered financial restitution, Brenda was forced into a humiliating corner. She had to list her own pristine suburban home on the real estate market. The sprawling house where she had hosted her lavish Sunday dinners. The very dining room where she had tried to bribe me with my grandmother's stationery was sold to cover the cost of her arrogance. She had attempted to steal Helen's sanctuary, and in the resulting fallout, she lost her own. For a woman who worshipped social standing and country club prestige. Above all else, the final punishment was delivered in black and white print. The local Traverse City newspaper caught wind of the canceled real estate transfer and the ensuing criminal charges. They published a front-page article detailing the probate dispute. The journalist outlined precisely how a prominent Grand Rapids woman had attempted to swindle her incapacitated mother. Brenda's carefully curated public image shattered overnight. Her affluent friends stopped returning her phone calls. The charity boards she served on quietly asked for her immediate resignation. She was exiled from the kingdom she had spent her entire life trying to rule. A month later, the bureaucratic dust finally settled. The weather in northern Michigan had turned crisp, signaling the deep freeze of approaching winter. I took a Friday afternoon off from the clinic and drove north. I navigated the familiar winding roads along the bay until I reached the gravel driveway of the cottage. The property sat perfectly still against the backdrop of the gray, turbulent lake. I stepped out of my car, the cold wind biting my cheeks, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and damp sand. I walked up the wooden steps to the front porch. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key David Vance had returned to me. I slid it into the lock and turned. The heavy cedar door groaned as it swung open, revealing the dust-filled empty living room. The stone fireplace my grandfather built stood tall and untouched. The old nautical charts remained framed on the wall. The space was devoid of my mother's staging, empty of her greed, and cleared of her suffocating presence. I walked into the center of the hardwood floor and closed my eyes. The war was over. The silence in the room was profound, and for the first time in my life, that silence belonged entirely to me. Legal victories possess a clean, definitive edge. A judge strikes a wooden gavel, a signature is recorded in a heavy ledger, and the conflict officially ends on a piece of paper. But biological reality does not obey court orders. Winning a brutal probate battle did not magically repair the damaged blood vessels inside my grandmother's brain. The vascular dementia continued its relentless, inevitable march. I had successfully dismantled my mother's fraudulent empire and secured our family heritage, but I could not save Helen from the encroaching fog. The disease took its natural course, eroding her memory day by day, systematically stripping away the sharp, formidable history teacher who had engineered her own rescue. However, I could fundamentally change the landscape of her decline. As her court-appointed emergency guardian and sole conservator, I possessed the absolute legal authority to dictate her medical environment. I immediately pulled Helen out of the sterile, landlocked facility Brenda had chosen. My mother had selected a place based on geographic convenience and budget maximization, prioritizing her own comfort over her mother's dignity. I utilized the assets securely held within the irrevocable trust to fund a drastically different standard of care. I transferred Helen to a premium specialized memory care community, situated directly on the shores of Lake Michigan in Traverse City, located just a few miles down the coast from our beloved family cottage. The new facility did not smell like industrial floor wax or pureed fruit. It smelled like fresh pine needles and the crisp, clean air rolling off the massive bay. The architecture featured soaring floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed natural sunlight to flood the expansive common areas. As a health services manager, I audited the clinical metrics thoroughly before signing the admission paperwork. The patient-to-nurse staffing ratios were exceptional. The medication management protocols were flawless. The caregivers were highly trained medical specialists who treated the elderly residents with profound patience and genuine respect. I had placed my grandmother inside a beautiful fortress of competent, compassionate care. I visited Helen every single weekend. The drive north from Grand Rapids became a quiet, meditative ritual for me. I would arrive on Saturday mornings, sign the visitor log with my authorized signature, and walk into the bright, airy sunroom overlooking the water. Helen was usually sitting in her specialized ergonomic wheelchair facing the vast expanse of the lake. Her cognitive decline was severe now. The astonishing lucid windows had ceased entirely. She no longer spoke in full sentences, and she rarely recognized my face. The sharp, vibrant woman who had hidden a ladybird deed under an antique nightstand was gone, replaced by a gentle, quiet presence lost in a permanent twilight. But there was a critical, monumental difference in her daily demeanor. The frantic, clawing terror that had plagued her in the previous facility was completely absent. She no longer smoothed her blankets in a sudden panic. She no longer whispered desperately about missing folders or locked water. The ambient anxiety had evaporated. On a particularly cold Saturday in late January, I brought a small item with me to the facility. It was the piece of blue sailing twine. The braided nylon cord had rested in my winter coat pocket ever since the dark morning we unsealed the legal envelope. I walked into the warm sunroom, pulled a comfortable chair up next to Helen, and greeted her softly. She looked at me with a mild, pleasant expression, offering a soft smile to the nice young woman sitting beside her. I took the blue twine and carefully wrapped it around the padded armrest of her wheelchair. I worked the stiff nylon through a series of loops, tying a perfect, secure cleat hitch knot. I pulled the ends tight, ensuring the cord lay flat and smooth against the fabric. I knew Helen could not articulate the memory of the sunfish sailboat anymore. She could not recall the bright summer afternoons on the wooden dock, or the detailed lessons she had taught me about holding fast against the wind. But dementia care relies heavily on sensory grounding. Tactile familiarity can provide profound comfort to a wandering mind, even when the specific context is permanently lost. Helen looked down at her armrest. She reached out with a trembling, frail hand and brushed her fingertips across the blue nylon. A spark of deep, unspoken recognition flickered across her face. She did not know what the string was, but her body remembered the texture. Her hands remembered the rough, sturdy weave of the nautical line. She rested her palm over the knot, her posture relaxing completely. The twine became a quiet anchor to her past, a physical tether to the life she had built and the legacy she had fought so fiercely to protect. We sat together in comfortable silence for a long time. Outside the massive glass windows, the winter waves crashed violently against the frozen shoreline. The Great Lakes are wild and unforgiving in the winter, but inside the sunroom the air was warm and perfectly still. Helen turned her head away from the glass and looked at me. Her pale blue eyes were clouded, searching my features without finding a specific name. She did not know I was Audrey, the granddaughter she lovingly called Little Bird. She did not know I was the medical administrator who had audited a fraudulent warranty deed. She did not know I was the legal conservator paying her medical bills. But she knew she was safe. The profound absence of fear in her eyes was the greatest victory I could have ever achieved. Helen reached out her hand, leaving the blue twine, and gently patted my hand where it rested on my knee. It was a slow, deliberate gesture of gratitude. It was a motherly comfort offered by a woman who had given absolutely everything to secure my future. I placed my other hand over hers, holding her fragile fingers, letting the tears I had suppressed for months finally fall silently down my cheeks. I sat in the quiet sunroom and reflected on the immense cost of this battle. The holidays had just passed, and my apartment in Grand Rapids had been entirely empty. There were no forced Sunday dinners with dry pot roast. There were no frantic manipulative phone calls from Diane begging for commercial loans. There were no condescending lectures from Brenda about preserving our suburban social standing. I had lost a mother and a sister. I had deliberately amputated my own immediate family to stop a spreading infection of greed and betrayal. The isolation was a heavy burden to carry a permanent ache that would never fully heal. Society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, a mandatory obligation that must be preserved at any cost. But I had looked at the steep cost of keeping my family, and I realized the price was my grandmother's survival. I chose the woman who had tied my shoes, taught me how to navigate the rough water, and trusted me enough to hand me the keys to her rescue. I lost the people who shared my genetic makeup, but I protected the only person who actually mattered. I looked out at the churning icy waters of Lake Michigan, feeling the solid warmth of my grandmother's hand beneath mine. The storm she had warned me about had come and gone. The legal foundation held. The physical sanctuary remained intact. Family is not a biological default. Family is not a required compliance policy you must follow blindly until it destroys you. Family isn't the people who take your power when you are weak. It is the people who lock the door to keep the wolves out.
We spend our lives accumulating the markers of a successful American life. We work grueling hours to secure the manicured lawn, the reliable vehicles, and the tuition payments for schools that promise to give our children a head start. We build these external fortresses, hoping they will keep our families safe. But Audrey's story is not merely a legal drama about a stolen lake house in Michigan. It is a profound, unsettling mirror held up to the psychological sickness of our modern era. It forces us to ask a terrifying question. While we are busy building our financial portfolios, what exactly are we building inside our children? When we examine the devastation wrought by Brenda and Diane, we see the American dream warped into a blind, desperate pursuit of material wealth and superficial status. They allowed greed and the illusion of social prestige to entirely obscure their humanity. Diane rationalized stealing from her incapacitated grandmother because she needed to pay for her children's private school. She convinced herself that maintaining an affluent image was a valid excuse for profound moral decay. This is the great tragedy of prioritizing the material over the relational. Money, property, and lakeshore cottages are inherently transient. They can be sold lost or weathered away by time. When parents place a higher value on wealth than on human dignity, they plant seeds of ruthless entitlement in their children. True filial piety and family devotion cannot be purchased with designer coats or catered dinners. It is measured by the quiet, glamorous sincerity we show when our parents grow frail, when their minds begin to fade, and when they can no longer offer us anything but their vulnerability. Look closely at the two distinct inheritances passed down in this narrative. Helen left Audrey a physical house, but her true legacy was the quiet, unyielding strength of character and genuine love she instilled in her granddaughter. Helen taught Audrey how to navigate rough waters both literally and morally. Conversely, Brenda handed Diane a legacy of deceit, entitlement, and greed. There is a stark warning here for any parent raising children today. Do not fall into the trap of believing that leaving your child a heavy bank account or a prestigious degree is the ultimate measure of your success. If you fail to instill a strong ethical foundation, your money will simply turn your children into cruel, calculating individuals. They will become the kind of people who are willing to consume their own relatives the moment those relatives become weak or inconvenient. Parenting requires us to repair our own moral compasses first. Your children are constantly watching you. They do not learn their values from the lectures you give. They learn them from the choices you make when you think nobody is auditing your behavior. True ethics means protecting the vulnerable. It does not mean covering up your sins with an expensive wardrobe and a polite, respectable facade. The greatest inheritance you will ever leave your child is a sturdy, incorruptible character. To build that character, we must cultivate wisdom, which requires independent thought. In many traditional family structures, there is a dangerous misconception that loyalty demands blind obedience. We are taught to keep the peace, to respect our elders without question, and to hide our ugly truths behind closed doors. Audrey used her wisdom to pierce straight through the suffocating excuse of doing things for the family. We must teach our children the emotional awareness to distinguish between genuine love and manipulative control. Do not use your authority as a parent to force your children to accept the unacceptable. Teach them that staying silent in the presence of evil is not an act of loyalty, it is an act of complicity. True wisdom means breaking free from toxic familial expectations and understanding that authentic love must always walk hand in hand with truth and justice. Cultivating this kind of wisdom requires immense, often painful resilience. Audrey endured a devastating emotional toll. She had to sever her ties with her own mother and sister to protect a grandmother who was slowly losing her memory. This is the definition of profound courage. Raising a resilient child does not mean teaching them how to ruthlessly climb the ladder of success or how to step on others to achieve their goals. True resilience is equipping your child with the inner fortitude to stand entirely alone to protect what is right, even if it means standing against the world, even if it means standing against their own blood. We must raise children who have the courage to look at injustice, even when it sits at their own dining room table, and firmly say no. Life is a relentless training ground, and the home is our primary classroom. We must act now, long before our own minds begin to wander and our bodies grow frail. It is a chilling realization to reach the end of your life vulnerable and in need of care, only to discover that the children you raised have grown into predators circling your bed. We can change the trajectory by doing the difficult internal work today. We can strip away a fraction of our material greed and replace it with genuine selfless empathy. We can stop worrying about our pristine social standing and focus instead on cultivating peace within our own walls. A family is not meant to be a hierarchy where the powerful exploit the weak under the guise of love. A family is a sanctuary. It is the people who stand on the porch and lock the heavy wooden door to ensure the wolves cannot get inside. When parents lay a foundation of ethics, use wisdom as their compass, and teach courage as their ultimate strength, they create a future generation capable of living a life that is truly meaningful. If Audrey's quiet war resonated with you, if you have ever had to draw a painful line in the sand to protect someone you love, you are not alone in the dark. Subscribe to the Fluffy Revenge channel, where we continue to share the stories of those who refuse to remain quiet. We all build a legacy, day by day, choice by choice. We assume the foundation will hold when the storms inevitably roll in off the water. But as you look around your own living room tonight at the faces of the people you are raising and the people who raised you, you have to wonder, if the fog ever settles over your mind and you forget how to defend yourself, who exactly will be holding the keys to your house? And more importantly, what kind of people have you trained them to be?